Do you mind if I take it?
No.
Did everyone get a copy of the agenda tonight? All right. Did anyone not get a copy of the agenda tonight? Okay, great. As you can see, we have a very full agenda tonight. Just to recap our last meeting where we left off 2 weeks ago, Wednesday, we had some good discussion around the fact that we had a number of questions that had been surfaced through the prior meetings that had yet to receive responses from either COGCC, the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, industry, or our representatives from the Rocky Mountain Arsenal or Tri-County Health. As a result, we held off on a meeting last week to allow for additional time for those parties to complete responses to the questions proposed by either the Citizens Council, the City Council, Commerce City's Special Counsel, Mr. Barber, et cetera. Those responses began coming in midweek through end of week last week, and so hopefully folks have had some time to consider those. Just to give a sense of the volume of information that we've received back, this stack represents the direct responses to those questions as well as exhibits, in many cases from the COGCC, where their response cites a specific regulation, and that reference helps give additional context to their response. The agenda that we've established tonight was intended to cover the majority of the time walking through those questions and answers, allowing for any clarifications to those questions, and then beyond that, identifying any additional areas where we needed further clarification or input from the appropriate party. To that end, a number of the questions that have come forward from our Citizens Committee members relate to environment and public health. And so, as folks may recall, we invited Ken Conrad with Tri-County Health to join us over the last couple weeks, and so Ken has become Conwright has become a regular member of the committee to help provide insight from Tri-County Health's perspective. On a similar note, we have added Mr. Charlie Sharman from the Rocky Mountain Arsenal to help provide added perspective on the Rocky Mountain Arsenal cleanup efforts. Tonight we have Kent Custer, who is here from the Colorado Department of Public Health, and he is here at the request of COGCC to help speak to a number of the environmental questions related to air, water, et cetera, that were not in the purview of COGCC to answer directly. So we want to make sure we've acknowledged your presence, and thank you for coming tonight. Anybody have concerns or comments on the agenda before we proceed? Okay, great. And just again, knowing that folks may not have had a chance to look through every single question, thought it might make sense that we sort of step through those in a logical order, spend a reasonable couple minutes talking through those responses, and allowing for any additional color commentary from folks like our guest from CDPHE.
Before we run through those questions, we had prepared something. Is it possible to, we just have a PowerPoint that's kind of the basis for all the questions. Is it possible to start out there and integrate the questions into the PowerPoint?
Those questions are the direct questions that were submitted by the committee or to the committee?
Well, no, yes, they're integrated into our PowerPoint.
If that'll help facilitate the presentation, I'm open to that.
I think it's important because I think we've got a lot of questions out there, regarding air, regarding water, regarding, all sorts of concerns of the citizens. However, I think there's a basis for all these concerns, and then we kind of put all that together in a PowerPoint. So
I guess the point, though, is we've got the questions that have been received thus far from the committee or from the community. We've got responses in the context of this. Does the PowerPoint follow the same order of questions?
The questions all fit into each slide on the PowerPoint, yes. Okay.
I just don't want us to have difficulty jumping around and folks following those documents.
That'll be a problem.
That's great. Do we have the slides
right
to put up? That's all right.
A lot of the questions are centered around concerns, and I want to make sure that we are addressing really the the basis of all these questions. I mean, we wouldn't have questions if there wasn't concerns. So based on these concerns, we have gotten from our citizens, we've kind of compiled just a quick PowerPoint here. And I think that a lot of these questions can be integrated into each of the slides. So let's see here. Okay. With the questions, I think the request from a lot of us is that the citizens really want to see a real-time full discussion on fracking where it's currently taking place. For example, Weld County, that was probably one of the bigger suggestions for us in terms of the concerns that we had. First-hand stories from those that were directly involved, how it's going so far. We wanted active participation from our citizens because that is really why we're all here, and addressing those concerns, addressing those questions.
Pointed at the computer.
I think your head's in the way there. Oh. I'm kidding.
It's pretty hollow.
That's okay. The other concern that we had was we wanted to have an analysis of the effects of the fracking on the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. I know that there's been some talk at the past couple of meetings with Charlie and with Jim. However, we wanted to go ahead and suggest that an objective third-party analysis by an expert in a related field, such as seismology or geology, would be done. We wanted to have a comparison of deep water waste injection to what the oil and gas industry plans to do with each well in the area surrounding the arsenal. Determination of risks. How great is the risk? Where is the risk greatest? And since Endarco is the one who is really interested in moving forward, I think that we wanted to take a look at how many leases, how much acreage, how many wells, and how many permits were submitted to date. Really, the concern from the citizens is there is the feeling of an assault on our civil rights. That's why we have the questions. We can bring a lot of these questions up right now if we want to in terms of what this slide represents. However, we wanted to pop up this map also because the big concern was the area is so huge that we're wondering, and the citizens were wondering why exactly we have to do it behind the Starbucks. Why do we have to do it next to the houses when the area is so huge? We also wanted to have a panel discussion on the human health study in Garfield County. It was, from all intents and purposes, a lot of our citizens had read that and had spoken with us a number of times regarding that. We also wanted to get the opinion of the industry on that study. And then in general, here are some questions from our citizens. Why do you want to risk the health and welfare of men, women, and children using a process that is known to cause harm? The new technology was surprising to people because it is so new and nobody knows really what the effects of it are. Water was a huge one, and I know we have a lot of questions in regard to water. And also, again, just to reiterate, the RMA is a huge concern in terms of the contamination. Okay. And that's the end of our presentation, and I wanted to just make sure, again, if we're not going to be able to have citizen comments at the very beginning, that we got our citizens' input included.
Mr. Chair, could I ask Jody a question? Jody, just so we have terminology straight here, you use the terminology fracking. And I think that the drilling and completion of an oil and gas well involves a number of different phases. And so I'm just wondering if you could define what you mean by fracking so I understand, sort of exactly where you're lasering your complaints or where the citizens are, and maybe it's on everything. And
well,
that's what I'd like to.
Yeah, we use the term fracking in general terms because a lot of us aren't scientists, and so the term fracking is really, you could exchange that for whatever they're going to do that might harm us. And I guess I wanted to make clear too also that You know, we have a lot of concerns, and, you know, really this is why we're here, the citizens. The citizens need to be able to ask questions. We need to voice our concerns. And thank you for clarifying that, because you're right. We don't know the proper terminology, and it's whatever could cause harm and what they're doing at the wells.
Thank you.
If I can chime in here, you know, I think by using the term fracking in very general terms, it is not a general term. It is a specific term to the completion of a well. Mm-hmm. There are drilling processes, completion processes, and production processes. We've had a number of presentations. I know our agency has presented separately from this committee,
right,
to groups of citizens. Anadarko provided a presentation with, you know, technical information in a very approachable form.
Right.
I don't think it's fair to the people who are presenting information to then take and not take that information in and say, okay, let's talk about the drilling process.
Right.
Let's talk about the completion process. Let's talk about where the issues are. You know, our agency has you know, a great level of technical expertise in many different fields. We've got folks with environmental backgrounds, geologists, geochemists, engineers. We've got an average of 20 years experience, some of that directly in the oil and gas field. So when people are talking in very general terms, it's hard for us to put a finger on what concern it is, identify it, and figure out a way to mitigate it and handle it or prevent it.
Okay.
So we really do, and I think this committee would benefit greatly from specificity. I think that's a really important thing.
Absolutely. I guess I could be more specific in non-scientific terms by saying anything that causes pollution, potentially pollutes the water, causes any type of noise pollution, destroys our roads, potentially by the trucks, you know, anything that's injecting chemicals that are potentially dangerous into the ground. You know, instead of everything that does us harm, maybe that's more specific. But again, we're not scientists. We're not. If you'd like to give us a more of a lesson on that, I'd be gladly listen. But you know, we're not familiar with that. So that's all I'm trying to say is in general terms. And we can drill that down if you'd like.
No, and I think it's a good jumping off point, and I think it's in line with the direction that we've tried to take with the committee discussion. I think to Greg's point, we had the initial discussions that provided us with an overarching look at the process from tip to tail at a fairly high level, with some basics on intensity of activity. We certainly don't know all yet, and so a lot of the questions that have been submitted thus far by the community tie directly into questions about health, welfare, noise, water, and other factors that hit at each phase of that process. And so one of the things that we've talked about trying to do to help guide the discussion and make sure that we are hitting on each of those points relative to the process is to say, let's spend a night talking about phase X of the process, and whether that's siting or the initial drilling of the well or the fracturing of the well or a recompleting of a well, so that we all leave that session that night with a clear sense of what noise impacts might be, traffic impacts might be, air and water impacts might be, so that out of that we can identify opportunities for a request for monitoring on air or water, guidelines about what we want to do to mitigate traffic or noise. And so I think the hope is that we look through these initial responses. There are certainly going to be additional questions behind those, and we need to be able to give those questions back so that we can get further information and help guide that discussion. I think the real-time discussion on fracking relative to what's happening in Weld County or elsewhere is a really valuable discussion, but it doesn't fall directly under the purview of this committee. And I think that's something that Renee and Steve and I can take back to council on Monday and say, hey, there's a request for additional dialogue on this at a broader level. And I know Mr. Benson has had one community meeting at Landmark thus far, and there is talk about scheduling a subsequent meeting, and I think what would be ideal is to look at what would be appropriate to put on the agenda for that night, who would be the right guests, and make sure that we have good notice and good attendance so that we can do some deeper dives on those items.
Okay. I want to back up really quickly because I want to make sure that we're all on the same page here because are we discussing, and I think we had this discussion a little bit earlier, so we're just moving forward, we're going to be setting up regulations. So we are allowing fracking. Is that what we're saying right now? We are going to resign the fact that we are going to frack in our neighborhoods. Is that what we're saying? Because I want our citizens to know, and I definitely want our citizens to know because I keep seeing, and I just got this on my driveway last night, that the City Council approved an extension of a moratorium, which isn't really the case. So I think there's some false information out there. I think there's some misleading information out there, and I want to make sure that our citizens have the right information.
You bet. And I think those are fair questions. And I know that many of us on council share your frustration with the way that the press handled the update from our meeting 2 weeks ago. If you look at the city website and the press release that the city published, it was quite clear that the council continued the item relative to that 6-month moratorium to continue the discussions in this committee. So the city's press release, which should be the basis for those stories, was directly on point. The fact that the news did not report that accurately is not directly in our control, and I know that our communications director seeks to help clarify any of those points of confusion. I think relative to the question on are we moving forward with the assumption that we're going to allow fracking, I think we've heard from Mr. Barber and from COGCC, and I would perhaps put Mr. Barber on the spot really quickly to just say, we've sort of started this discussion with council to say, we understand coming into this that as a short-term or near-term objective, we have no way to stop this activity in the near term. We do have an ability or an opportunity through these discussions to find ways to the extent possible, without overstepping our bounds by law with the state regs, do everything we can to safeguard our community. Now, where it comes to fracking as an area of concern, those are discussions that are going to have to continue to get taken up at the State House and at the federal level. And I think for those matters, it is absolutely appropriate for our community to make our voices heard to our elected officials at the state level and at the federal level, where the ultimate decision on a statewide decision could be made. Mr. Barber, I don't know if you want to chime in on any of that.
That's one of the reasons I asked for a clarification of what fracking means to you. I mean, if fracking means everything associated with the process of drilling, completing, and producing an oil and gas well, the Colorado Supreme Court has said that a community does not have the authority to completely ban that. So if your question is, can Commerce City completely ban oil and gas activities within the boundaries of Commerce City, I would say based on the current status of the law, the answer is no. Now, can Commerce City, like many other cities, regulate it in terms of where it can occur, when it can occur, how it can occur, what kind of mitigation must exist, what kind of agreements can be entered into with the oil and gas companies and with the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission to address the very things that you and a number of other citizens are here for? Yes, you can do that. And it then becomes almost a line-by-line question of whether the city's regulation goes too far. And so we have not drafted those regulations, so I think if you're assuming that the city is just going to say, yes, it's fine, come on in, do whatever you want, that's certainly not what I'm being told. But if you're asking whether the city, in my opinion, as a lawyer, can ban it, I would ban oil and gas exploration, I would say
right.
The answer is probably no.
Right, and we're aware of that. piece of it. However, I know that, and we've mentioned it before, that of the special circumstances that we face with the RMA. I know that some people don't want to admit the fact that we live on a very toxic piece of land, and I think that deserves second, third looks, and from individual third parties who are completely objective in that too. So, those are our concerns, and we're not saying that we want to just jump in and say, no, we're not going to do it. But, the last meeting we had, Mr. Castillion mentioned that, I think a lot of people were mentioning, let's just get this thing over with. Let's just get this done. We've done this 1,000 times, even though we've never done this. We're feeling very rushed. We're feeling like people want things done. We want it done yesterday. And, given the special circumstances of the RMA, deep concerns in the community.
And just one further point, Jody. There is a process that exists at the state level with the Oil and Gas Commission, whereby a community like Commerce City, anytime a well request is made, can petition to have certain conditions put on it, presumably even to prohibit it.
Right.
And that would be a decision that the commission would then make.
Okay.
There's another process that we're just starting to explore, which is called a memorandum of understanding, which would do the very thing I think that you're speaking to, which is to say to the commission, look, this is the Mountain Arsenal's backyard. This is a special and different place as compared to Weld County. And perhaps there are processes that can be put in place that might apply to most or all wells that are drilled here that would, in essence, be conditions of approval for any permit. So that is all in process. Where it comes out, I don't think anybody has any idea.
Okay.
If that answers your question.
That does. Thank you very much. We have citizens here that can't be, and we've had this discussion beforehand, but I'm not sure. We have a time frame usually set at the end of the meeting. We have many citizens who can't make that time frame. Does anybody here have an objection if there's citizens who cannot stay for the entire time to voice a question now? Matt, do you think that's an issue?
We have I would dare say, a legal consideration in that this is a public and posted meeting, and so we have an agenda that shows a time for that public comment at 7:50 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
So if people plan attendance on coming to participate in that public comment session, and we place that comment session earlier,
the reason I'm asking is I do see people out in the audience who, we talked last time about not having, we bring in surface water from Denver. I do see people in the crowd here who have wells within our community. So, especially for those people, special considerations for them if they can't stay. So.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, and I'm sorry, Ken, we have a vast number of responses back on these very questions, and so I would love to get into those questions and make sure that our citizens know that these will be made available on the website as well, so that they can, if they're not able to sit through the meeting tonight and hear these discussions.
If those are going to be made available on the website, I would think that it would be more important to have them speak so that they could pull those up later, is my point.
I guess
just suggesting.
the thought, and maybe I'm off base, is that if I'm sitting in the audience and I have a question that's covered in this list, would it be better to hear the answer to the question so I hear it and then ask a follow-on question where it doesn't fully meet the question of the individual?
Or potentially we could just cross it off if they ask the question. Again, this is all about our citizens. I just want to make sure they're heard. Does anybody want to ask a question that has to leave? Is there anybody out there that wants to ask a question that has to leave right now or very soon?
Okay.
Or can wait?
So
okay.
why don't we go ahead and strike a balance? We will move into the portion of the agenda where we're going to review.
I just had a comment if I could.
Yeah.
I haven't read the article that Jody's referring to, but we did, in fact, extend the moratorium for another 30 days.
It's not a moratorium.
A week and a half ago.
There's no moratorium in place, right?
Right.
Takes two
Well,
readings.
we extended it for another 30 days so that we could continue
We extended a
to
stand
work
down
with
of
this group
activity.
and work on the memorandum of understanding.
But why don't we do this? Because there is confusion about this. I will read verbatim the press release from the City of Commerce City.
How about if we read the definition of a moratorium first? I think that might be helpful.
I will read the definition, the
Have it
press
right here
release
if
from
you'd
the
like
City
it.
of Commerce City. Point of order. January 23rd, Commerce City continues oil and gas moratorium ordinance. The City Council of Commerce City unanimously voted this evening to continue. Definition of continue means to not take a vote on, but to continue the matter to a future meeting for further consideration. to continue Ordinance 1880 until February 27, 2012. This action was based on public testimony from residents as well as a proposal from Hillcorp Energy, which agreed to a voluntary 30-day moratorium on hydraulic fracturing and drilling operations within the city. The continuance also will allow the city's Oil and Gas Land Use Review Committee, this body, comprised of residents, industry, interest groups, and council members, to continue their work and reach a consensus recommendation on potential changes to the city's land use development code. The committee will also discuss the potential for a memorandum of understanding with the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission regarding operational considerations for future oil and gas development. The ordinance, if adopted, would create a 6-month moratorium on any surface or subsurface use for the conduct of any oil and gas operations that include hydraulic fracturing or drilling activities within the city limits. City Council will consider the ordinance and the work of the Land Use Review Committee at its February 27th meeting. Information on oil and gas activities within the city can be found online at c3gov.com/oil and gas. Interested parties can also sign up on the website to receive email or text updates. So the city's position was quite clear. We did not pass anything. We continued the matter for future consideration. So the fact that the news reported that we had passed a moratorium was inaccurate. And I don't know that there's anything more.
It's been that way. I mean, it's been continually reported that way. So, and I'm not saying, you did it. I'm just saying it's reported that way.
It is.
And it's not a moratorium. A moratorium, and in case you're wondering, is a legally authorized period of delay in the performance of a legal obligation. So it's not a moratorium. I just want to make sure that we're clear about that.
Even if we passed the moratorium ordinance, it wouldn't be legally enforceable, so it wouldn't meet your definition there. So I don't.
So
It wouldn't be
think
legally
we've.
enforceable?
I don't know. We've got a 30-day moratorium, and we're supposed to be working
Maybe that's the
with
problem.
this,
We keep calling it a moratorium.
with
It
this
was not.
group
Right.
to try to work something out. And I would hope
As
that
the
we
press
can get on
release
with
said,
that. And let's.
We've got to withstand that for 3 more days. Let's just.
Here's my great challenge. The community clearly wants answers to questions. I dearly want to get answers to questions so that we all have a common and an enhanced level of understanding so that we can engage in discussions that will allow us to provide the recommendations to council on the actions that they should take. If we can get into those questions, we can start to make progress in that vein. And
You know what? I just cleared up that nobody wants to ask a question, so I'm fine. Let's dive into those questions.
Okay. We had a question from Mr.
I'm sorry. Jody, I have a list of questions myself. Ken Conwright, Tri-County Health Department. Mr. Barber, and I think you answered this, but bear with me. So you confirm that the city can or cannot prevent oil and gas exploration in the city?
What I confirmed is that if the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission has granted a permit, the city cannot totally ban that activity. The commission can ban that activity, and that's based on a Colorado Supreme Court decision.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, just one other thing. Sorry. And can Commerce City, the city of Commerce City, apply or work with or come up with a memorandum of understanding or something like that that puts additional land use controls on oil and gas exploration inside the city limits?
Yes.
Thank you.
And then, Jason, if I could just follow up and give you some other thoughts. It is our view that the Colorado Constitution does grant to its citizens the ability to use the Constitution to protect clean air and clean water, such as through a citizen initiative or by city council. Notwithstanding the Vos case is quite old and on different geologic facts than what we find today. Particularly in the Vos case is related to the city of Greeley attempting to ban drilling. And part of the facts in that case were the target formation was conventional oil and gas, which without effective drilling into it might not have the resource effectively recovered. That's not the geologic setting we find in Commerce City. This play is in the Niobrara into a we could call it the bed load, the mother load. It is not in a trap. Therefore, it's ubiquitous. Now, that fact alone could give the city some pause to consider a ban on pads within the city and drilling for the resource under.
Can I interrupt? Mr. Wilson, you're not an attorney.
But I'm entitled to my opinion of the state constitution.
You are entitled to your opinion.
All right, and so I gave it. Right. So
We're so far
no,
off
it's
the
clearly
agenda.
on the citizens' agenda.
Responsive.
Now, wait a minute.
And we're not politicizing.
When you go onto that agenda, then you're not into ban. It won't be covered. So I'm trying to fill that gap in.
I'm going to just
And certainly
try.
the citizens have every right to ask these companies, since we've got a 8,000...
Mr. Wilson, if you would allow the citizens to ask those questions, we could get to that point.
The citizens aren't allowed to talk right now. They have to
Because we haven't even moved down the agenda. We haven't, I mean,
Listen, Chris. The citizens certainly have a right to ask you to go
You
elsewhere.
asked the citizens if they had questions.
Point
No
of
one
order,
has a
please.
question.
Not that one.
The agenda was to answer the questions that were submitted in writing. The written responses are provided.
But Mr. Lepore, I don't think you were here the last meeting, but we discussed the fact that we, as representatives of the citizens, were very frustrated that we were not able to make any comments. We sat very quietly and we listened to your presentations. We sat very quietly and we were very polite in listening to your presentations. And in fact,
that we
the
were
last meeting,
requested
Mr.
to give by the
Castilian-
city council, to be
Exactly.
clear.
And we gave
So,
you
if
that
you would
opportunity.
pull up your PowerPoint again and compare the questions that you had up there, they are all answered in the responses that you either got from industry or
We
from
didn't
the
get
Oil
them-
and Gas
Most
Commission.
of them we didn't get until Sunday. So I have a day job. I wasn't able to comb
So
through
do
those.
we, yeah.
So
And-
your
and-
day job is what you're doing right now. My
Point of
job is
order.
separate.
Hence the dedication of the 75 minutes on the agenda to go through those questions, because we acknowledge that not everyone had time to comb through those pages, despite our best efforts and attempts.
So we're having a good discussion here, but we want to stop so we can read methodically.
It's
through
not a
questions.
discussion, it's politicizing an issue. If folks have questions, Mr. Wilson is not a member of the community.
He's a member
here.
of the panel.
We're trying to be responsive to the citizens
Okay.
that you are ostensibly representing here.
Right.
So if we could get to the questions that your folks have and maybe answer them, we would be more than happy to do that. But so far, we haven't been able to move off the agendas that everybody sitting around this table seem to have at this point in time.
Our agendas are protecting our families and our homes.
And we want to be responsive and respectful of that.
Well, last time it didn't really seem like it.
Oh, really?
Anybody
Okay.
who had eyes could see that you
All
did
right.
not want to be at that meeting last week.
Anyway, Jason, let me ask one question to Mr. Barber, and that is that if it can be substantiated that the health or safety of the citizens is in jeopardy, that will trump the oil and gas regulations. Am I correct about that? If that can be established?
Question has not been decided.
But the other question has, though, at least we'd have some kind of a chance, I think, going to court and say the health and safety is in jeopardy here. If you could establish that with a preponderance of the evidence, then you could trump, I think, the oil and gas regs. Because
Are you talking about a single well, or are you talking
nobody's going
about
to agree
drilling?
to put the citizens in immediate jeopardy. I don't
They're not beholden to the Clean Air or the Clean Water Act. So what?
We are.
We are.
Okay.
There are standards in the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission rules
And the-
that are derived from those federal and state statutes that are developed in cooperation with the Department of Public Health and Environment that operators must adhere to,
And in my
all of which is set
opinion,
forth
they're
in the answers to the questions.
And that may be the case.
That's his opinion, that's fine.
Mr. Wilson?
You have to understand that those rules and regulations have been adopted through a public process. They've been in place for decades. They were arrived at by discussion among well-informed experts, environmentalists, oil and gas industry representatives. That's the public process. These rules didn't come out of nowhere. I know Mr. Wilson doesn't think they're protective enough.
But it doesn't matter what you think or what they think or what the laws are. We all have eyes and ears, and we see what happens. We hear about Pavilion, Wyoming. We hear about the Marcellus Shale. I mean, we hear about it. That's why we're here. So we can
Okay, so there are 47
we can bring these things up, and we can reasonably discuss them. I mean,
There are 47,000 active wells in Colorado. Tell me 47,000,
15,000, just 30 miles north of here.
straight north, more than half.
we have one right outside of our window, right behind our Starbucks, too. So that's, we're perfectly well aware of where the wells are.
All right, so the 47,000 wells in Colorado, tell me how many injuries to citizens you can identify as a result of exposure to toxins from those? How many?
Well, the only health effect assessment that was underway was...
Just stop, Mr. Wilson, just stop.
Was one...
Let her answer the question. Do you know, have you heard any?
Well, here's the first thing. You told us you were going to put a fence around your well behind the Starbucks. There wasn't one there for 2 months. We walked over there. If a child would have wandered over, they would have probably killed themselves. I saw that with my own eyes, and I looked at your permit that said you'd have a fence. You couldn't even do the easy thing. So therefore, I'm left wondering if you can do the really hard stuff, which is contain the contaminated water when you bring it out, which is keep the emissions from coming off of the contaminated water. That's what I'm wondering. If you can't put a fence around the well, I'm wondering how you're going to accomplish the really hard stuff. That's my question. And by the way, Mr. Wilson also speaks with me because we are sitting on the panel together.
All right.
Jason, could I say one thing? I think it's awkward to posit that the citizens have no rights because there is a law written some time ago that's been validated by the Supreme Court that says that citizens have no rights, that the issues of oil and gas exploration and development in this state, let me finish, and this is so valuable to the oil and gas industry that the people have forfeited their rights. Now, my suggestion to Mr. Barber would be, and I hope that the City Council would consider this option, is looking at reforming the Enabling Act, because the Supreme Court decision is based on that act. If the Enabling Act allows for citizen participation in its own life and well-being, then I think that's a reasonable avenue to explore. Because it's not written in stone, it's just, it's an act.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, and that is the responsibility of the state legislature. What we're dealing with here is the
But Phil, you said that that's what you were looking at was the state legislature and every option. All I'm doing is giving you an option.
It is an avenue, that's for sure. If the legislature tomorrow banned oil and gas exploration in Colorado, I don't think any of us would be here today. That hasn't happened yet. Maybe it will.
Or if the oil and gas industry maybe did a better job of protecting people when they went in, we wouldn't be sitting here.
And that's what we're trying to do as far as I'm concerned.
And Mr. Barber had a legal analysis, which I thought was very legitimate, that Mr. Wilson was responding to. Could we let him finish that response, please?
Well, I think the issue on the Voss case, you heard me, I'll just repeat quickly, they were after targeted conventional oil and gas, so there was certainly some legitimate geologic conditions associated with recovering that resource, which required vertical drilling within the city. I just want us all to reflect upon the fact that this play in the Niobrara, this ubiquitous formation that underlies 8,000 or 9,000 square miles here in the Front Range, is not suitable. It does not require vertical drilling in every location. It's recovered by horizontal drilling and fracking. And that represents the opportunity with this technology to have more remote pads and longer horizontal wells that would not necessarily have to be in the city. It's just one advantage of taking, one opportunity to take advantage of this technology and the way the city's stretched out each.
And Mr. Wilson, if I can just say, one of the examples that we gave in the meeting 2 weeks ago about breaking our discussion into piece parts, right? We've all come away with a high-level understanding of the phases of drilling, right? We've got permitting, siting, fracking, recompleting, this progression of events that leads up to a productive well. The goal was to try and get to a point where we could take that discussion around the drilling and use that as a basis for discussion for you to bring points forward just like that, to say, we think it makes sense to recommend in the context of Commerce City that we only have wells of that nature. But we need to be able to get to that point in the discussion, and what I feel like we keep doing, because there is so much energy tied up in this through all of us, that we keep throwing the questions out in an order that doesn't allow us to assemble a set of recommendations. So to the extent we can try and building block this discussion, I would hope that we could do that and answer questions and identify additional questions where appropriate. I want to get those ideas out on the table. I want to understand where there are potential legal strategies that we need our counsel to look into. But when they're coming at us from every direction, it's a little difficult to hold on to those and really consider them in the context of the whole of what we need to try and do here. Does that make sense?
I only said, Jason, because it was brought up. That,
Okay.
there's no way out, that it's, no exit. And I don't think that's true.
Okay. So everybody received the questions from Mr. Aker, forwarded along from our members. I hope folks have those handy. We will, let's start with, let's see, I think this is the response from the state. We had the CDPHE responses. This was the, I believe these were the.
But the Constitution gives the citizens right.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
But we think it could be done within the rules as Pittsburgh has done.
And I think I explained this in my response to the questions that I did provide answers for. Again, this is Greg Duranlo with the COGCC. There are questions that we did, as an agency, defer to the CDPHE. Like our agency, he's been responding to similar things in other areas of the state, and we do not have responses on the air quality questions.
Okay.
I believe, and I think Kent would agree with me, that the air quality concerns and questions are significant, and they do bear, that's an important discussion to have. To the extent that Kent is willing and able to answer those questions here in person tonight, I'll invite him to do that. But I would also say that, he is not the Air Pollution Control Division at the CDPHE, and so he may elect to defer some of those answers. So I will work with Kent to try and get some answers to the questions that we don't address here tonight.
Okay. So then let's, was this your response referring back to the CDPHE? Let me find my original email here. I apologize.
Is there, I would like to ask the citizens, is there anything of concern that you would like to start with for those of you who are needing to leave?
I would like to hear a little bit about air quality and groundwater quality monitoring, if that has happened at the wells near us and what the results are, or if that could happen.
That sounds like a good starting place.
Is that go ahead, I'm sorry.
My name is Kent Custer. I'm the oil and gas liaison for CDPHE, and so in this capacity, I represent CDPHE, but I certainly don't have the expertise in all those various areas. But I can tell you that we are sitting in a non-attainment area as far as ozone is concerned, and I was present.
What does that mean?
That means that we're not meeting the ozone standards that were set. And so EPA has designated this area as a non-attainment area. They're the ones that make that designation, and they require the state to then put a plan together to try and reduce that ozone. And there is a plan in place that was put together by the Air Pollution Control Commission. Those people are appointed by the governor to serve on that board, and there's a great deal of expertise that goes into that plan, and it's been in place for some time now. I don't know the exact particulars of that, but I can tell you that there's a number of monitors in the entire area. That non-attainment area basically extends from Castle Rock all the way up towards Fort Collins and east as far as Greeley. And so that entire area is considered a non-attainment area, and there are special air quality rules that are in place, and oil and gas operators have to meet pretty strict emission requirements with their equipment.
Question for you. First of all, I'm familiar with the non-attainment. I've read about it, but why should we, I guess for people who like to know, why should we be concerned about ozone is my first question. And what contribution to the emissions of the condensate tanks, for example, have to that? If we were able to reduce that, would that be helpful?
Well, they are required to be reduced. The volatile organic contaminants, VOCs, are probably the main thing, and the NOx. those two together combine with sunlight to form ozone, and ozone is a health issue. And so there are provisions in place that require the operators to control the emissions from, for instance, the condensate tanks and the crude oil tanks, and they're strictly administered. We have 4.2 employees in the Air Pollution Control Division that do inspections, and they have to cover the entire state, but most of their inspections are done in the non-attainment area to ensure that those restrictions are in place.
Dan, if I could follow up a little bit there. I'm just started looking at science came from the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration, which has a unique facility in Erie, Colorado, closer to the current production. And they did some monitoring last winter when some of these volatile organic compounds are the highest, especially after unmixing during the night. And they found quite a signal on propane and ethane in the atmosphere coming from natural gas activities there in Erie. In fact, they compared Erie's air pollution to Los Angeles because of that. So we're certainly correct.
And I'd like to see a copy of this because I think it's particularly outside the realm of what we're discussing.
So far outside is to be in Erie, where we have more wells.
Now, Mr. Wilson, I would like to see a copy of the report because you continue to cite things like this that none of us have had the benefit of.
That's fair enough. Okay, I can provide you the report.
And quite frankly, as a regulated industry that controls 98% of our air emissions in this state, something like that would be on our radar screen, and that's the first I've ever heard of that report.
Well, it should be on your radar screen because
I'd like to see the report before we have a conversation.
What happens here with these condensate tanks is the state rule. The state rule requires that they do 95% of. They get 95% when the condensates are flared. That takes it down to 1 pound per barrel of emissions. What I'm describing here is, even though you have effective controls, cumulatively, we can have an air pollution problem, and do have, in Weld County, contributing to Denver's non-attainment area. Here in Adams County, everything east of Kiowa, west of Kiowa Creek is in that non-attainment area. Now, despite those conditions, when we asked Director Neslin whether he would direct closed-loop completions in Commerce City, he was hesitant. Now, that's an additional means of controlling some of these VOCs. In addition to coming out of the condensate tanks, they can also be controlled with green completion or closed-loop completion when the volatiles come back to a pit.
And let me just say that green completions is one of the things the industry is more than happy to talk about with Mr. Barber when we get down to putting things on the table.
And that's the point I wanted to make, Mr. Wilson. I think these are the suggestions that we need to get to. And when we have the evening that we dedicate solely to that facet of the process, we need to laundry list these exact items and say, we would like consideration from industry on these points. We would like consideration from COGCC on these points. And where we're able to gain agreement from industry or COGCC, we move those items forward. If we find that there are items that are not appropriate for us to carry forward, we need to take them to our state representation, we need to take them to our U.S. representation, or our citizens need to champion those in parallel. So I think, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, we need to keep the conversation focused on the Commerce City scenario and hopefully use examples where relevant and where we can provide that basis so all of us can look at that study and say, oh, okay, I understand the source of this, it's an acknowledged source, whatever the case might be.
Right, but I don't
and then we
have
can
any of those examples from Commerce City. I mean, Erie's very close to us. And we don't, I mean,
Well,
my point.
I think we ought to answer the lady that asked the question. She said, I think you said, what's going on with that? Ma'am, in respect to the gentleman from the State Health Department, CDPHE, I call it the State Health Department since I've been around so long. But there are regulations. We live in a non-attainment area because of all the people that live here. That's why it's called a non-attainment area for ozone, as he mentioned. And there are regulations, state regulations, regarding oil and gas development required to meet certain standards. There's inspectors, they have to do certain permits. When they do that, are they perfect? I can't answer that. There's certainly apparently debate about that, but I don't want you to go away from here tonight thinking that there's no regulation as far as air quality goes on oil and gas exploration.
I have a question relating to all of this, the oil, her question, and the wells. And actually, it was one of the questions I submitted, so it covers all the bases.
Is this in the response set from COGCC?
There's probably one that is not responded to.
Because we're pending a report.
Actually, this is air quality one, so it didn't need COGCC, that's why.
Okay.
But you're Ken?
Kent.
Kent, okay. So either Ken or Kent can answer this maybe, but what I was wondering is, each well, I'm sure, has a limit. I don't know what that is, but say you can emit this much. I don't know what the particular VOC, but what is, if it's a certain chemical that, or a group of chemicals,
Right.
There's got to be a limit.
There is.
Now, where did that limit come from? Do they say this well can do this because if we put this in the air, there's school down here, those kids will only breathe this much air, and that's fine? That doesn't. How does that limit come about?
Through the state implementation plan, the city.
Let me start it.
We have 3 wells, and that produces
Right.
this much. We have 4 wells. In Weld County, we have 18,000 wells. That produces this much.
Basically,
There'd be a different limit since there's so many wells there.
and there is a different limit. There is a different limit. Statewide, there's a limit for VOCs from this kind of, from these type of facilities, and that limit is 5 tons. I just lost it.
That's okay. I mean, we can get that.
But if that's submitted,
It's
then we are
5
due.
I'm sorry, it's 5 tons per year. They're allowed to emit 5 tons per year if they're outside of the non-attainment area before they trigger a permit from the Air Pollution Control Division. If they emit, I believe I need to look at my notes here, but there's a lower limit that requires them to submit an APIN, and that's an air pollution emission notice, and that's used for inventory. And that's what the operators use to calculate and make a determination to see if they have the potential to emit greater than 5 tons per year, which would then trigger that permit. In the non-attainment area, that trigger is at 2 tons per year, which is it's a pretty small amount, actually. And when you look at what's going on today with multi-well pads, you have a number of wells that are hooked up to these battery tanks. Normally, they're required to get a permit, and so they're working through the Air Pollution Control Division. They have to submit an APIN, that inventory form, and do those calculations if they have the potential to emit greater than 1 ton per year.
If they go more, they have to get a flare stacking burn it.
No, we have that anyway.
Burn it anyway, or what do you mean?
We flare, the flares are in place to prevent disruptions. So if there are, as he was just saying, when we have multi-well pads, it is more economic for us to contain all of those emissions and put them back into the pipeline, because otherwise we're venting off a commodity that you could otherwise be selling. So it's not in our best interest to just let things go uncontrolled. But the flares are there when there's a burp or something in the system to capture that and make sure that those emissions do not exceed those limits that he just articulated. The other thing I want to make sure you all understand is we're a small part of a big air pollution problem here. You've got 2 refineries right here. You've got massive power plants, dry cleaners, automobile spray painters, gas stations. I mean, everything goes into this pot, and we are a small slice of that pie. The lucky thing is we are a regulated entity, so it's easy to come after us as opposed to imposing additional restrictions on, all of us that drive cars. The EnviroTest and the Enhanced Inspection and Maintenance Program is part of the ozone non-attainment SIF. So, as we look at further regulations, on this industry, because we're in a non-attainment area, the oil and gas industry has probably stepped up disproportionately to the other industries because we are an easy target. So rather than making citizens go out and clean up the junk cars that are kicking off the emissions equivalent of 100 new cars and saying we're going to start taking these junk cars off the road, regulators say, well, we're going to go after the oil and gas industry because in order for them to develop their resource, they need to come and get a permit from us. So it's an easy fix from a regulator's perspective because we are a regulated community. So I want to make sure we're all talking the same lingo. And, to the questions that we've talked about earlier, this would warrant a night to have Air Pollution Control Division come in here and talk about the ozone SIP, the process that goes into developing that, the industries that are all regulated as a part of that ozone SIP, of which we're one, and make sure you understand that this isn't just willy-nilly. We're not out there just emitting pollution out there. We're part of a solution. We're part of a problem, as we all are, and we're doing our part to make sure that whatever we're doing is not degrading the air pollution any more than we can allow it to happen. So,
Tracy. Can we get a microphone so we're being recorded?
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Chair. Question for you. Who exactly are you regulated by, and what is the state's role in your regulation?
On air quality?
On air quality and in general?
The Air Pollution Control Division, which Kent works for or with, at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, they have delegated authority from the Environmental Protection Agency. So when the EPA comes in and says a state has a sophisticated regulatory structure in place to regulate whatever it is, water quality, hazardous waste, solid waste, air quality, they give the state that authority to regulate it. So by delegation from EPA, the State Air Quality Control Division has regulatory authority over all matters relating to air quality.
In addition to the air quality, just as the oil and gas, as a whole, is it mainly the EPA that oversees what you do, or is it a variety of agencies?
It's a variety of agencies.
Okay.
And in Colorado, fortunately, we're all lucky as residents here to have a very robust Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. So within that state department, there's a hazardous waste division, there's a solid waste division, there's a water quality control commission, there's an air quality control commission. What other ones am I missing on the environmental side?
You've got it.
So all these agencies have authority given to them by the EPA that says you have the technical expertise, the enforcement structure, the inspection obligations. You are a sophisticated, under EPA's imprimatur to go out and regulate whatever industries, us, refineries, breweries, anything that's out there operating within Colorado.
And I think another piece of that that's important to add is that it's not only state regulations, it's federal regulations, and it's those two that are rolled in together into that permit that's issued to the oil and gas operators. And to speak to your question about per well, it's based on the production facilities, and so there could be a large number of wells that are feeding into these tanks, and that's where we're controlling the emissions.
So,
And if,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
and if you look at the response to questions, the written response, the website for the Air Pollution Control Division is included in the response to questions. And
is this the one from COGCC one, or?
I believe.
I think this is Koga's response.
Drew, I think this was your response.
Trying to figure out who responded to what, but it's
two. And one was. One has a picture of
So-
a well on it, and the other
this one is CDPHE.
Koga.
.state.co.us. That one.
So it sounds to be like, if I understand it correctly, that there are several state entities that run on the authority of the EPA. Is that correct? Okay.
And I'd like to add, you're talking about the environmental protection aspect, air pollution. The COGCC also has and has primary regulatory authority over oil and gas operations in the state, and that's by legislative mandate.
State legislative mandate or federal or both?
State legislative mandate, and I don't know how the federal has passed down authority to the state. Our marching orders are from state statute, and we do also regulate, waste. Not just drilling activities, not just the activities, but also the waste handling, spill cleanup. So we do have a very robust regulatory regime, and I think you could, I think that's supported in the responses to the questions, et cetera. So.
Well, I think that there's...
Tracy, the federally mandated air quality standards, again, many of you may have from time to time heard of threats to withhold highway funds, things like that from the federal government. That's what the EPA has delegated down to the state level. And again, then there's state mandated regulations and standards that the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment enforce.
So in layman's terms, so that we all understand this, you regulate or you inspect what you say you're doing, right? So he's saying he's got what is it called that automatically detects if there's a leak or if there's emissions that are coming?
Well, presumably our entire system is contained and restricted to be within the parameters established by the state. So they have inspectors that come out. They look at our paperwork in addition to actually visiting.
You have 4.5 inspectors for the air quality? Is
4.2.
4.2. And how many active wells do we have?
47,000.
Okay. So if by chance there is something wrong, obviously there's probably I took probability in college and I didn't do very well, but I can still figure that it probably wouldn't be detected.
It would actually, because we have to keep records of everything. So when we go in for a permit, the state looks at everything that we've done, and there's a requirement, in fact, or an obligation in Colorado for self-disclosure. So if we detect something, if, God forbid, our flare wasn't working and so we inadvertently emitted VOCs above the level that we're permitted to, we report that to the state, then they begin enforcement actions against us under that situation. So we are obligated to report any violations of our operations to the state to make sure that where they may not have an inspector on site that day, they can go back through our record. There's a exactly. Yeah.
How often does that happen?
Not very often.
You find those records
at the state.
Okay.
And to that point, there is a link on the cogccstate.gov website that relates to oil and gas industry spills and releases. And this is a reporting tool that anyone can go out to. I believe we linked to this from the city's oil and gas website or page on our city website. And from that, you can query over a date range, by incident type, et cetera, and see quite a bit of that information, as well as the other regulations that come into play. I think we're covering in piecemeal form a lot of the questions that are in this list, and I think if we can maybe...
Jason, if I could. I certainly want to agree with Mr. Castillo. We could devote a whole night to this. And let me just follow up a few reasons why. On the west slope, there was a group of citizens who did their own air monitoring and found hydrogen sulfide at a well. And granted, it wasn't done by the state. It was questionable perhaps with respect to the scientific integrity of that, but the state did inspect. And the state inspector from Oil and Gas Commission, Stuart Ellsworth, did indeed find hazardous hydrogen sulfide. And he made a statement in the press that similar conditions were occurring in Weld County with some of the pits, not as a result of sour gas field, but as a result of some of the chemical reaction in the pit. So far we've been talking about just the volatile organic compounds as they mix with NOx.
Let me just get a
So
clarification.
we haven't discussed hydrogen sulfide with respect to that. Just a minute. You talked, let me talk.
Well, I want to make sure
he has a point of clarification he wants
to make. We're talking about the fact that Stuart Ellsworth found hydrogen sulfide in a well in Weld County. He's an inspector for the Oil and Gas Commission. So that's another potential air pollutant not covered.
And not an inspector for the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. He is the engineering manager for the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission.
Okay, I got his title wrong. All right. But he's the one who was reported in the press as saying he found it. That irritates you, but he is the one who reported on it. That's another air emission that could come from this industry that we need to talk about.
We do need to talk about it.
All right.
And
And
we need
the
to
fact-
factor that
consider
into
this.
our recommendations.
All right, but consider this. The fact that we're in a non-attainment means we haven't met our goals.
That's right.
And certainly, if we brought in somebody from the Air Pollution Control Division, they could get us to understand the relative contributions of VOCs coming from our collective automobile and other sources versus natural gas. Another aspect of this is hazardous air pollutants that don't get combusted. And that's where I was cut off before. There was a study on such hazardous air pollutants being done by Colorado State University called a Health Impact Statement Assessment for Garfield County. Unfortunately, that study wasn't completed. So I certainly agree with you. We need to bring in the Air Pollution Control Division and sit down and have a full-length session just on the hazardous air pollutants, H2S, the volatile organic compounds from the industry.
And I think in the agenda suggestions that were put forth and set aside in our last meeting, there was an entire night that we suggested be dedicated to such discussion. And so rather than give it short shrift in piecemeal discussion tonight, I would love to see us try to get back on the agenda so that we can talk about what our next meetings need to be and who we need to have here and how those discussions become outcomes and recommendations. Because you bring forward very good ideas, but we need to be able to map them to the questions that have been asked. I can't tell you now tonight which questions we've touched in an ad hoc fashion tonight versus which questions we haven't. And I don't want to... I
haven't seen an adequate one yet, Jason.
I'm sorry?
I haven't seen that we've covered one adequately yet.
No, we haven't. We haven't touched a single question in here that I can point back to.
Right.
And I want us to be able to do that. Our citizens deserve full answers. And I want to make sure that the questions that have been asked or the answers provided so far, if there's something that lacks clarity, my hope is that we could present follow-on questions to help gain further clarification so that we do all have that common level of knowledge. And so I apologize if I sound frustrated, but I think we all want the same thing. We want to know more than we do today. And so it's a question of means and ends. If we all want to get to the same end, which is to know more and make good recommendations, by what means do we get there? Do we continue to have circular discussions that don't necessarily give us a way to track where we've been and where we need to go still? Or do we try and jump in and start to move down this list and say, okay, we've covered this one, we've covered this one, we need more information on this one. To me, that seems like it will give us all a better sense of progress and accomplishment, even if we don't get an answer we necessarily like. It at least gives us an ability to track our progress. Right now, I have a difficult time saying what we've actually covered tonight.
Well, I think that was an excellent point, though. I mean, we haven't talked about hydrogen sulfide. I mean, now we've added that on as our secondary piece of this, so we can supposedly move on. But I mean, I think that's a good point.
Jason, can I suggest, the responses to the questions that the COGCC submitted were delayed. I think it would, no, they were submitted, but I think I finally, by the time they got assembled from various people responding to them, got them, reviewed, assembled, got attachments put forth, which I think add value to the responses that we gave. I think it was Monday of this week. That's not very much time. So my thought would be, why don't we go through those questions that our agency provided a response to, and I know there were several different bodies of answers. I believe Koga submitted one, and then regarding the arsenal, there was a separate one. Since mine came late, maybe that would be the best way to go through them. Again, we didn't address specifically the air quality questions. So to that degree, we can maybe tangent off and catch those while we have Kent here, if he's able to, or if he can, at least jot them down, take them back, and come back with some responses.
And you're right back to where I was hoping we would go. So if folks can refer, is it about? Go ahead.
Actually, it's on my sheet here. It wasn't really answered. On page 5 about air quality, and I was asking
to
could you use propane instead of fracking?
one.
You know, Brandon can answer the technical side of that, but, you know, one of the things that we've talked about a lot in this state is diesel fracking. And so, you know, why would we want to put a potentially flammable, dangerous gas that is a hydrocarbon that isn't much different in terms of carbon chains, I don't know what the technical term is, from diesel? So Brandon's got a good answer on that. But
Well,
it's not something
and I'll speak to the fact that, you know, we're all here for the same purpose you are. We want to be as safe as we can. We want the environment to be as safe as we can. And propane's a great question. There are companies that pump propane. You know, basically, I think I personally would recommend that it's against what we're trying to achieve here, because you're going to have propane tankers on the road instead of water haulers. You're going to have emissions of propane into the atmosphere. Like, we do our best to control that stuff, just like, you know, Chris was telling us about, you know, controlling our VOXs, or VOCs, but, you know, if we pump with propane, we're absolutely going the wrong direction. And then that's kind of why we're here to tell you, is like that is the opposite of what you want to achieve. Because we've moved to be more environmentally friendly, and, you know, as far as Halliburton goes, we have chemical indexes on how we rate chemicals, and we pump environmental chemicals, and we have different ratings on each one of them. So we do offer those things. So that is our goal as well.
Does that company have a proprietary hold on the use of propane?
No, not that I'm aware of.
So, Brandon, are you saying that there are processes that do not use water to
Yes.
fracture?
And it's answered my
produce?
questions that the COGC or COGA submitted as well. Is Halliburton does have processes that don't use water, such as nitrogen, which is an inert gas, and also CO2. And we do have those processes, and we offer them to the customers like Hillcorp and Anadarko. And those are out there and available, and I would highly recommend those over even propane. But then you also have the danger of a compressed gas being driven down the road, where water's inert, you know what I mean, and it's not a danger going down the road.
Brandon, what's the price differential in these technologies?
A lot of it depends. You know what I mean? I can't say directly, but there is a slight price differential. A lot of it depends on job size and a lot of different things. There's a lot that goes into it. I can't just spurt off a number, but.
But could we find out the volumes, the different volumes that would be required, say, 1,000 feet of horizontal fracking using water, using hydrogen?
Yeah, we could definitely determine that if you gave me the stipulations. We could
So
definitely
guys,
determine
I
that.
just want to use this exact example to try and link back to my comments from our last meeting and my comments earlier. We have a slew of questions that responses have been given, and we've not yet talked about them, and it's now an hour and 20 minutes into our meeting. We talked about a proposed agenda that would have us focus discussion on specific areas of the process so that we could do deep dive discussions on a thing like you're talking about. We had put forward an idea to talk about specifically well drilling, completion, and recompletion to identify intensity of activity by well and over number of wells, potential risks and current/standard mitigation to air, water, noise, nuisance factors. And I think the hope was that we could bring forward in those discussions examples or questions around the technologies and the processes used in that phase of the operation so that we could identify where there were things that we wanted to consider in our request to industry. So if that makes it all sense,
Well, yeah.
I would love to get there. But
I read these responses from the COGA. Mostly it's, we don't have an answer until we get down to specifics, which isn't an answer.
and we haven't had the meeting to.
Let's go there. Okay.
Let's get into the questions.
Okay.
So we had an offer from COGCC to talk us through their questions. Does everyone have the document from COGCC?
Right.
The first question.
Sounds like you don't. But
I have them on my iPad here too. If you want, I can. It came in a note.
The first question, does the COGCC attend casing, cementing, integrity tests? The COGCC has a rigorous inspection program. We conducted 12,000 site inspections last year, primarily unannounced. We receive notification of spudding on a well, and that triggers our inspectors to have the opportunity to visit the site. Do they inspect every
spud well? No, they don't. They also, but the other, hang on. I'm sorry. Spudding, and I appreciate that. Thank you. Spudding is the initiation of drilling a well. The rig stands up and the bit hits the ground. They have spud the well. You'll hear that. So that's the initiation of drilling.
Thank you. We're just going to, as we go through this, need some
And that's great. I appreciate that. We've had
definitions, if you will.
in our
I mean, you're
staff
used
that
to
we need
it, but
make
we're
sure.
not. And
Yep.
so, thank you.
But there are no potatoes involved.
There are no potatoes involved. So one of the reasons that we are able to not attend every spud well is operators are also required to submit a completion report, a drilling report, and a completion report. So they file two separate reports after the fact showing exactly when and where they did put their well. It shows the casing program, and our engineering group looks at that casing program, verifies that it meets the permit condition. And again, the casing is the steel pipe going down into the ground, cemented in place. They verify that the cement is in place around that casing through that program. And then additionally, just a minute, when they are completing a well, hydraulically fracturing a well, they are required to monitor what we call the Braden head pressure. The Braden head is the annular space, which is the space between the casing and the open hole portion of the well bore. Alternatively, it's between one casing and another. So if there's multiple layers of casing, it's that airspace between it. If any pressure changes are noted during that Braden head monitoring, they are required to report that. Additionally, and I think Brandon would attest to this, if they see an issue with their Braden head monitoring, they're going to shut down their fracture stimulation operations. They do not want to frack out of zone. They do not want anything going anywhere but where they want it to go, and they'd see it there and they'd shut it down.
Greg, could I just ask a question?
Sure.
If you're familiar with wells near here, would they require the surface casing cement to be completed through the Fox Hills into the pier?
Yeah. Our rules don't explicitly require that. Our rules require that the surface casing program protect the groundwater aquifers, and I did attach that language to my response. It's in Rule 317, but in practice, our engineers, when they review the permit to drill, so before spudding, before anything, when they're looking at the permit to drill, they review the operator's proposed casing program and review the geology surrounding it. They look at water wells, they look at surrounding oil and gas wells, they look at cement bond logs from other wells, and logs, not cement bond logs, but well bore logs of other surrounding wells, and look for that contact of the pier shale. And they make a casing adjustment to those wells to make sure that the casing program is encountering the pier shale.
Here, what I understand.
And then one other point on recomplete applications, they also do a review of the existing casing and the existing cementing program and determine whether it is adequate. And we do make changes to the casing on existing wells and cementing on existing wells.
So you have that latitude, but an operator could conceivably get a plan where the cement casing, the surface casing, only carried the cement 50 feet below the nearest domestic well. They could get that.
I believe that's the requirement in areas where the aquifer is unknown.
Oh, I see.
We have a significant, a very good knowledge base.
But maybe it doesn't apply here, where we know where the Denver Formation, the Arapahoe Formation, the Laramie Formation, the Fox Hills Formation. Would it be reasonable, let me try to get Jason a specific thing, would it be reasonable for Commerce City to ask for surface casing 50 feet into the pier, so it would be, surface casing would extend to the lowest aquifer?
I don't think that would be unreasonable. I will tell you that you're already getting that. I mean, that is in practice, and you can review existing permits in the greater Wattenberg area, of which this is ostensibly a part, and you will find that that is the case, that permits, the surface casing is going into the contact of the pier shale.
Good, good. And then for recompletions, the same thing would apply. That is, if there was lack of cementing and the surface casing down to the pier, that presumably could be re-entered and re-squeezed?
Yes, and I don't know the proper technical terminology to that. I did have a conversation with our engineering group about that, and in fact, on the Custody 1 well file that is on our website, it's available for everyone to review. There is a specific review of the existing casing program. I believe the document is even called the Casing Program Review or something, and it's submitted to our agency.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any further questions on what I've numbered, question number 1, regarding casing and cementing integrity tests?
Not offhand. I think we'll come back to that when we get into that drilling discussion later.
Number 2, does staff inspectors stay in a location for infinite periods? You know, like any other agency or organization, we have staff turnover. I will say that. But our inspection group is based in the area in which they inspect. They are residents there, and so they do work a designated area. Sometimes the boundaries of those areas shift based on the the overall activity. We have requested and received legislative approval for additional inspectors. So those positions will be added to our staff.
How many are there?
There are currently
15, I think.
15 inspectors. We're adding 2 more, and those will be added in July 1, 2012.
Do you think that's adequate for the number of wells?
They conducted 12,000 inspections last year. That's a quarter of the wells.
How many wells?
And there
12,000 inspections on 12,000 different wells?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. Now, there's an advantage. If we go out to a multi-well pad, we tick off multiple inspections. But they're looking at every wellhead. They're checking pressures on every wellhead. They're looking at all the facilities on the location. And there's also standalone locations that they're inspecting in that as well.
Does that number of inspections include complaints or concerns that they've gone
Yes,
back
it does.
out to look at? So there could conceivably be one well that they had to visit.
That they had to visit multiple times. And we are responsive to complaints, and we do follow up, and that actually brings up a good point. Those complaints oftentimes get kicked over to a different group in our agency, and so the inspection group is heavily supported by the environmental staff, the engineering staff, and so they're not the only ones looking at things.
Greg, I have a question. By my arithmetic, if you have 15 inspectors and you have 12,000 wells, they're doing 2.5 wells a day for their entire work year. Is that reasonable? Is that reasonable, and does that give you a good feel for what's actually going out in the field?
That actually seems kind of low to me in terms of going out to a producing well site and doing an inspection. A person who's very familiar with what's going on, can see a lot in a very short amount of time. So that, I think it does reflect the fact that they're not just, going from one well to the other, to the other, to the other. There is a lot of follow-up work and that they're engaged in.
So that's a pretty thorough oversight that you're providing. 2.5 wells.
A lot of them are very close. hadn't done the arithmetic. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I mean, my arithmetic may be bad.
Mr. Benson?
Jason, who determines how many inspectors you have? Or who determines that?
You mean Greg?
Yeah, Greg, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's dictated really by the legislature and the need. And we're pretty fortunate in that we are, we've asked for additional inspectors in the past, and we've gotten support from industry on, yes, you guys ought to have more inspectors looking at this. I think, the more credible our inspection program is, quite frankly, the more credible the industry becomes.
And I agree, we ought to have as many inspectors as it takes to inspect every well once a year, but somebody's going to have to pay those inspectors, and where is that money going to come from? The state's already got $1.5 billion shortfall that they're going to have to find a place for this year.
We do, actually. The entire
But, I mean, it's just...
The commission is funded by severance tax, so we are a funded agency.
So we could raise the severance tax. Is that right?
You could approach the legislature about that.
Actually, you'd have to go to the voters.
Go to the voters.
Oh, yeah, I guess that's true. So, but we, and so the industry has, when we say we need more inspectors and the industry says, yes, you do, they're going to the legislature and saying, get these guys more tools.
Well, wasn't there an issue before the voters a few years back to raise the severance tax to compare with surrounding states, just to bring it up to that level, and it failed? Right. I mean, there was something on the ballot and it failed. Right. It failed, didn't it?
Yeah. Get rid of the ad valorem tax credit.
Okay.
Which is actually something that is very important to Weld County.
Well, that might be something for us to encourage our legislators to do.
Yeah, let's hold the tax questions, and we should get those submitted so we can have them considered in a subsequent discussion. Were there any other questions on this item?
Yeah, I do have a question about, your budget's around $9 million according to what I've read. And
Okay.
How much of that is devoted to inspection and safety with these well sites?
I'm not involved in budget allocation. I don't know.
Presumably all of it, because that's their...
Well, I know that's not true.
Well, it's not like they're out goofing around on that budget. Their job is to regulate and inspect this industry. So
Okay.
all $9 million...
Chris,
goes to
I would
Thank you,
prefer that
Chris.
the state
I
answer the question rather than you. You don't know what their budget is?
Actually, I used to work at DNR, so...
Well, so then you tell me, how much goes to inspections? All of it? All of it?
100%.
All $9 million?
All 9 of it goes to regulating this industry, which includes inspecting and making sure that we are living up to those regulations.
Okay.
Greg, is there any part of the commission that's not relevant to this discussion, that you don't inspect a well, you don't look at, I mean, what aspect of the commission, being a staff person, is not germane to any of this conversation?
I would say our staff spends all their time involved in managing, regulating, overseeing the oil and gas industry. It's
You're not traveling to Hawaii.
It's what we do.
Well, of course not, Chris, but there's 70 people down there and 15 of them are inspectors. Now the question is legitimate.
But again,
I'm sorry, let's pull this back. We had a presentation 3 weeks back that covered an overview of the organization, and in that we saw the organizational chart for COGCC, and we had an opportunity that night to ask questions about budget and about hierarchy. If we have follow-on questions, let's submit those, and we can get those brought back. Does that make sense? I don't want to debate where 100% of the budget goes.
A question, though, is all it was. It's just a question.
But there was
when there's no problems, when there's 0% incident, and when everything is 100% the way it should be, there wouldn't be questions. So, I mean, I think the questions are perfectly legitimate, and it's.
I'm not saying they're not. I answered the question.
So it's 100%.
I said 100% of that budget is dedicated to regulating this industry, which includes an inspection function that Greg has spoken about.
Question three. Thank you, Renee. Are there certain operators that generate more spills or accidents and/or penalties? Are there certain areas of the state that generate the above? On our website, and Jason, you mentioned this earlier, I mean, all our spills and releases are available for everybody to look at. You can search our database by county, and you can see every single spill or release that's been reported to our agency. Sure, do some operators have more spills? Yes. They probably also have more wells. Are we tracking a percentage of spills per well per operator? No, it's not it doesn't serve the purpose of our agency. So it's a question that, I really feel that, and again, like Weld County, are there more spills in Weld County than Adams? Absolutely. So it's kind of a challenging question to answer, and I would point you to the website and the information that we have on that website for spills and releases. And I did
just a quick question on the website. When we do what you're suggesting, when we look at Weld County, we have a kind of a limitation. When we pull down the notice of violations and spills, we only get 1,000. We don't. It doesn't seem to allow us to get the others.
Then I would ask if there's specifics that you're looking into an area. You can also search by township and range. You can also search. You can add an operator to the query that you're running. So you can be very, very specific, and I think that's that's a much more valuable way to get information is to get specify your query again and what exactly is it that I'm looking for.
But one could go in and ask just for one company's notice of violations and spills.
I've got the webpage up. So on the inspection / incident inquiry, you can search on inspections, NOAVs, which are,
Notice of alleged violations.
Complaints, spill / releases, remediations, or MIT.
That's mechanical integrity tests. Those are required for underground injection control or UIC wells. Those are injection wells.
It looks like you can search on county codes, sequence codes, a complainant. So if you wanted to look for Sally Jones and the complaint she's made, the specific operator by name or number, I assume that's their license number or a registration number, a facility or lease, a location, and that's the geographic breakdowns, the quarter, the township, the section, the range, remediation project numbers, document numbers, and you can return up to 1,000 records in a query. I know when I looked at it, when I first found this and looking at Adams County, I was looking for incidents of problems drilling, spilling, et cetera, and what I found were not incidents of that nature, but problems at condensate tanks, a vehicle coming on site to do something, tearing out its fuel tank. I was surprised at the nature of the incidents that I found. It gave me a new perspective on the range of things that we want to consider, but I found it pretty handy, and I think the other thing to point out is that when you look at that site, you also have the map, the GIS system, which shows all the wells, and we were given this in our last meeting, if you recall, and so you can literally go in and on that website, find a well that's producing, and then go in and you could use the codes from that site and find out if there have been any incidents at that site. Is that a fair?
That's correct, and that's, in fact, I oftentimes do just that. I'm looking in a specific quarter section or a specific section, and I'll hover over each of those wells, get the information, which one is it, and then plug that into the database search.
Ms. Snyder, you have a question?
Yes, Greg. I was wondering, do you think you could put together just a glossary of terms, if you will, for us, so that way as we go through these discussions in the following weeks, we can glance back to that and not constantly having to ask time and time again what the different terms mean?
And we've actually put that request forward, and I believe, Koga, you gave a response back to staff that you had a source for that. Is that right? Is my memory serving me right? The glossary. COGCC is bringing that forward.
We can,
there's a couple.
We can provide a glossary. Okay. You probably have one there, Greg, that you...
I mean, there's a couple different sources for that. One is, a lot of the terms are defined explicitly as we use them in a regulatory regime in our 100 series rules, which are on our website. So that defines, very specifically many of the things. There's also industry terms, and I believe it's Halliburton's website. It may be your competitor's website, though, Baker Hughes, that has a great oil and gas glossary. I guess it may be Baker Hughes. So, I think we could do that. I think it may be more beneficial to, take those tools that are there, looking for specific questions that you have. But for the sake of this meeting, if it would help for us to assemble some of that, we can.
Yeah, I'm not looking for like a 100-page glossary, but if you could just give like a page or so of the most common terms that we would come up with, during these discussions, that'd be helpful.
Staff is working to get links to the known sources of information to make those available on the website for community access. I think the suggestion of a one-pager makes great sense. I know Jim and I both sit on Dr. Cog, and one of the things that is present within every agenda is essentially a one-pager of major terms that are used in those discussions, whether it's, FHWA or whatever. And so if anybody knows of a document like that, I think that would be really handy for us to be able to scan.
Come up like a page and a half of ones that I've run across, I put them in there. One thing I was wondering, Greg, if you could see on that website that you have the incident one, if you could see if the IT people could just add them, they're pertinent to this, like the MIT and the NOAAV. You mentioned what they are just now, but if they could put it on that site, then whenever you're visiting the site, you could go, what in the world is that? It would just say it instead of.
Sure.
It's got so much room on the screen, they could put it on there.
You're correct, and I will say that our website has a ton of information. I will also agree that it is sometimes hard to navigate, and it is sometimes hard to find, and if you don't know the specifics, you're absolutely correct.
Just below all that, if they could just put NOAV equals this, MIT equals this, on that one page. I'm sure the rest of the website they could work on, but
sure,
for now, just that one search page.
Okay,
do you have an MIT in-house IT department, or is it by the state, does it? Or?
It's actually, it's a state-supported function. So that's one function that the severance taxes are not supporting is the IT, although we also do have, we've got an electronic permitting process, and that is supported in-house. But I think that's something we can work on.
Move on to question 4.
Yep. Yeah, we're just going to say we got about 5 minutes to hit one more question, then we want to open it up to citizen questions for those that have signed up. Question 4, sir?
We've discussed this a little bit before regarding the notifications of fracking fluids used, why the 60-day wait. And I'd like to really emphasize that the notifications is just that. It's a notification. It's a tool of what went on. It does not afford a measure of protection of public health, safety, welfare, and environment. And that is done through a competent casing program, casing and cementing program. And that's why, earlier I talked about the notification of spudding, the Form 5 and 5A, which are the completion reports and the drilling reports and the completion reports, and the reviews of those, and the Braden head monitoring. So that said, why the 60-day wait? That was a public rulemaking process, and there were parties, there were industry parties. I don't know who all attended. I bet, Andrew, you know. There were a lot of people. There were reams of comments received. And so that time frame was vetted as something that was agreeable to all parties. I know you see that and you think, God, we've got, we're all on iPads and we've got iPhones and we've got all this technology, let's use it. it still, it doesn't, getting it in there that day doesn't afford any better protection as getting it in there 6 months later. And I think that was, that's one thing that we should really be cognizant of. Jim?
As a practical matter, why can't you disclose it at the time that it's going in the well, or 5 days later, or 10 days later? Why 60 days? I think that's what the question really is. I mean, why?
And as a practical matter, I'm going to have to defer to industry because
do they not know until 60 days later what they've actually put down the well 60 days before?
And the way the rule is, I mean, they have to define the volumes and the amounts and the percentages and everything else. And they may, because it's, they're on site right now while that operation is going, and they're managing their fluids and they're managing their concentrations, and they may not be able to determine, right there. They may need to reconcile before they submit. I mean, and you certainly don't want them, submitting in error. So
is this a matter that we would want to put on a list and submit to COGA or to COGCC that says we would like it considered that reporting periods be shortened?
I would go back to it. If the goal is to protect public health, safety, and welfare, I don't believe that reporting time, changing that reporting time frame provides additional protection.
No, and I understand that. I think there's a business case to be made that says if I invest in making my process faster, do I get anything more out of it? And I don't know that we have that answer.
With that, and add to it for Halliburton's benefit, if you had, like I said, an app, you went boom, boom, the day you looked at the chart, I don't even know, much last, whatever, you said this is much left, you could push that button and send them a bill, so you get a bill quicker, but send them a bill that day.
I'll address that. Just like the commissioner saying, the COGCC saying is, we do that. We can actually create that report as soon as we're done, and we absolutely reconcile chemicals while we're pumping. As soon as we're done, we have triple checks back at the yard, and then that base, there is a little bit of a delay from getting it to that on-site location, which is sometimes remote, maybe not in Commerce City, to the customer to where they can submit it. But that's the delay. Like, that is absolutely done. Just like you said, we have a program that we call Frack Focus. That report is created at the end of every well, and it's given to the customer of the well, the owner of the well, and then they need to report that. So there is going to be a little delay time in getting that, but that information is available as soon as we shut our pumps down.
Brandon, can I ask you a question? My understanding that part of the logic was that you have certain ingredients that go into the frac fluid, and that ingredient itself has a number of chemical constituents. And I think that the bargain that was struck was that you have to report the percentage of the individual chemicals of each individual ingredient.
Yes, sir.
So maybe you can actually do that right there on the spot. But it was my understanding that because of that sort of reverse engineering part of that, there was, a need for some delay.
There is some delay because, number one, we want to make sure our reports are accurate. So just like he's saying, we break down each constituent, but we also have to match up our volumes as well. And so because of our triple check and our quality process, it does take a little bit of time. But as far as knowing what we put in that well, we know when we shut down. But there's a lot of quality checks that we do after the process to make sure that when we told you it's 5 gallons, it's 5 gallons.
Does that take 60 days?
So I'm going to stem that discussion for the moment. We can pick it back up, but we've got questions from the community members present. On our list, we have a Rochelle Brackney who wanted to pose a question or make comment. Is Rochelle still here?
Looks like she left.
Okay. Anyone else who is here tonight that had a question that they wanted to pose? Okay. I will just say that staff has let me know that the submissions that we've received so far, or I should say the responses to questions that have been received thus far, will be posted to the Oil and Gas Committee website so that if folks want to go out and start looking at responses in advance of a subsequent meeting, those responses will be there for you to review. The other thing that we've asked staff to do is to put an ability on that site to submit a question. So if you've gone through and reviewed and you have an additional question you want submitted, we'll be able to capture those and get an answer in the works so that ultimately we have all questions posed, all answers received, available on the website, so any of us can go out and play catch up on that information. All right, pulling it back together. Any other? Oh, I'm sorry, Guillermo. I didn't see you. I did not see you line of sight through here. I'm sorry, Guillermo. You want to come up and ask a question?
Tell them use a mic.
Come on up and let's give you a mic.
Someone give me the other one.
Hello?
Hi, Guillermo.
Yeah, this is very unfriendly to the community as far as participating. For one, question I have for him is on the 60-day thing on reporting. How do you determine within those 60 days that what they did and what they put in, and how do you engineer what the inspectors are going to inspect if you don't know what's in there? And they're telling you what to put down instead of you telling them how to handle it.
Their drilling plans are provided to us on their...
No, I'm saying during...
Bear with me and I will answer your,
Okay, now,
answer your question.
I'm not up to your educational level,
Okay.
so please keep it down.
I will try. Their drilling plans are submitted on their application for permit to drill. Okay? So our staff reviews that. Following drilling, they're required to submit their completion report and their drilling report. On their completion report, it does show a volume of fluid. And at this point, our completion report is, that comes in a narrative form. In other words, they write it down. It's not something that, populates a...
Okay, I understand what you're... okay,
So
that's all I need.
In that, it tells how much fluid they ran in that well.
So they tell you what to regulate.
Whether they had any...
You don't tell them.
No, we are telling them what to regulate. We're telling them what they have to report to us. They have to provide to us the data that shows they did not have any pressure losses or any problems or any problems with their drilling and completion of the well. So our engineering staff reviews those submittals, and if they find any problems, then they go back to them right away. And that process, I don't know how the timing on that process, but I do know from talking to one of the gentlemen who reviews those that he's up to date. In other words, he's receiving those in and processing them, within a matter of days.
And he's an expert on all of the stuff that was put in and all of the pressures that comes up. And he's got all the answers.
He is an expert on reviewing those completion reports, so he knows what a proper well completion should look like and would know if he saw information that didn't support that it was a proper well completion.
Okay. Now, just a couple more since there wasn't that many questions. The process that you have right now is not right. A lot of you people here make one hell of a lot of money. Our community is here volunteering their time because they have questions. I myself would appreciate it if the people that are here from companies, from governments, would have a little bit of respect for the people that are contributing their time pertaining to our community. It's not right for a well-educated person that has worked with the company and then goes back, work under your whatever, and then goes back and works for the company that we are worried about, in a sense, to holler at our community people, to get off on it. She's just asking questions. We're asking from other communities to participate with us. so that we can know some of the questions to ask, or so that people can ask the questions we aren't able to ask because they have the expertise right now. As of right now, we've been asking how many wells in Commerce City, and we haven't gotten an answer. Well,
He didn't
it does.
receive that. He didn't receive that.
Well, we provided that to the committee, and I forgive me for not understanding, but my understanding was that Dan, Tracy, and Jody are taking the information from these committee meetings back to
That in itself. But see, you're putting information, okay? You're putting on the assumption that everybody, no, wait a minute, that everybody owns or has access to a computer. We don't. We're common folk, in a sense. And hey, I'm just giving you some of what I see wrong here.
Mm-hmm.
And one more thing, Mr. Jason, please. We're looking at the past and the present, but there's no questions being asked about the future. How many wells are going to be hit, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as soon as you find out if there's gas, oil, or whatever? Is there going to be explosion of this? Is there be some type of a control? The communities that are trying to build schools and right now can't pass referendums, and let's say the negative effect that people from the company, yourself, the negative effect that you're leaving behind, will we be able to, let's say, get assistance from you to pass bond issues so that we can build good schools for our children? So that we can bring another store other than King Soopers into the area? More rooftops? Those are the questions that we need answers to. It's not just 20 years, it's 100 years. And if you're going to do that, when are you going to stop saying we need to complete the wells? If you didn't find out the first time that you didn't have anything down there, why are you fracking anyway? You should have tapped it, closed it, let it go. So you've got technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Serna. I just want to speak to one of those questions. One of the objectives of this committee is to learn, and we want to help the community learn with us. We have a challenge in that. We can't have every person in the community at the table, every meeting, asking questions. We need to find a way to allow those of us that have been elected to represent you and those that have been appointed to represent you participate in a process of discovery and learning, and hopefully through that process take the things that we've learned and help share them through the community so that we all know more than we did in the beginning. As I said in our council meeting Monday before last, this process scares the hell out of us, many of us, because we don't know. Things that we don't know about are, by their very nature, scary. And so, as a result, there is great emotion tied to these discussions. The problem with that is that oftentimes, when our emotions override us, we don't have the ability to follow along in a logical, sort of fact-finding mode in order to assemble a good picture of what it is that's real about the perceived problem, what of this is not, and then make good decisions from there. And as your elected officials on this committee, that's really our objective that we've been charged by the rest of council to undertake. Respect the time of our citizens and the other experts that are at the table and try and accomplish that discovery process so that we can come forward with answers to the very questions that Mr. Serna asks. We want to know, and we posed this question a few weeks ago, and I think the gentleman from Anadarko suggested that we could potentially do positions so we know what the current holdings, if you will, are by industry in the area. As a complement to that request, we got a map that I held up a moment ago that provides a view of Commerce City and Adams County peripheral to the arsenal and shows all of the active producing wells, permitted wells, shut-in wells, plugged-in abandoned wells, and temporarily abandoned wells, as well as those waiting on completion. This is, again, information that's available on the website. To Mr. Serna's point, if you don't have the ability to get onto our website, please just grab one of us and say, there was a reference to such and such a document, may I get a copy of that? And we would be happy to have staff help get you that material. One of the things that I said the night at our council meeting that I asked for staff to build that website, and Steve was jumping in right there with me, was that we need to make information available, right? There's a ton of information available on the internet, and we can all sit down and Google all day long, but not know what of that is viable and good information or not. And so one of our hopes was that through this process of discovery, where we get information that we can all agree to as viable and good information, we make that publicly available so that you don't have to go out independently and try and do that homework. So that's our objective. Are we doing it perfectly? No. Could we do better? Absolutely. And we are trying to, each week, identify additional players to come to the table, focus our discussions in a smarter way, get new materials posted. Mr. Benson is planning to hold another community meeting similar to the one that was held a few weeks ago. We want to make sure that we help guide what would be appropriate to help further the education process in such a meeting. So my hope is that we're learning and improving as we go. We certainly want to get questions and comments from the community to help improve and enhance how we approach this process, and come to the right end for Commerce City.
One of the big questions, which is on one of our slides, is we'd like to see Anadarko's plan. How many wells are they going to have? What is their plan to open them up? Are we going to go bang, 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 bang? What is your plan? You obviously have what we call a master plan.
We don't.
There's nothing.
No.
So you have no plan to start any well or
As we've made clear, Mr. Chairman, this is an exploratory development out here with Niobrara. Despite what Mr. Wilson was saying earlier, this is a completely unknown horizon out here. So we don't know if it's going to be 1 well or 100. But at this point in time, we have no plans. That may change tomorrow. It may change 6 months from now. It may change a year from now. But we are currently evaluating the data, the seismic, all the things that Brad Miller spoke to this committee about 3 weeks ago. And we have no plans right now. Otherwise, the commission would have APDs on file for wells that we intend on drilling. I don't know what Hillcorp's plans are, but that's at least where Anadarko stands at this moment.
That's where it'll always be. They don't know the plan until they make an application to drill.
And actually,
there is no requirement. Just a minute.
No, actually, I want to jump in because I know where you're going, and I want to give information that was conveyed at our meeting several weeks ago when the other gentleman, I'm sorry, his first name, Brad from Anadarko, was here. We talked about the frustration of the late notice with the well that started the discussions here in Commerce City, and the permitting process and the local designee process, and how we all felt blindsided by that. We've obviously changed certain things. We now are a local designee, so we now get notifications. But to that end, Anadarko suggested that there's an even earlier point in the process that they would think that we could be notified, and that is I can't remember the name of that step. It was prior to the permitting process that we currently get. Spacing, that's right. And I don't remember because we haven't had the chance to talk to that in detail, but that is a significantly earlier notification window than the local designee process provides for today, and it would at least give us a sense that there's activity likely before the permit to come and drill is submitted. Is that right?
Well, okay, I have one. The reason why...
Can I just have that question answered before we follow it on?
Sorry, go ahead.
And I don't know,
to be perfectly honest, Jason, I got distracted during your question, but spacing is when an oil and gas company pretty much intends to drill a well within a certain geographical space, they ask the commission to designate that space and say, you're going to put X number of wells in the space. It's technically it's 1 well in that space. And that is probably the first application that the oil and gas company would file.
And that milestone is not currently part of the local designee process, from what I understand. We don't get.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think the commission automatically flips that to the LGD as they do an APD.
And so as an example of where these discussions have, I think, borne fruit, we've discovered that there is this earlier place that we could know that activity is happening so that we could start to plan and anticipate.
Spacing doesn't tell you what the company's planning.
Well, okay, to follow up on that, just to touch on what you're talking about, the reason why I would like to know, because I'm looking at this map here and I see the, as far as producing wells and all that, permitted wells, I don't see any when you come down on the north side of the arsenal, come on to the west side. The reason why I'm asking that, because we needed to see, when we get to regulations, how far back we can do a setback. So that's what we need to find out, where you guys want to drill, and then we could determine where our setback, where we could determine where our setback's going to be. And if you can't give us that answer, that makes it very hard for us to go, when we get to the regulation process, to see exactly where you guys want to drill based on our setback.
When a company files an application for permit to drill, it tells the Oil and Gas Commission the location it intends to put the well in at. It would comply with the state setbacks. If it didn't, the commission would kick it back.
State setbacks are what?
150 feet, 350 feet. Look, I know you don't agree with that, but that is the state setback.
Say a word.
You didn't have to. Okay?
Hold on, Matt. Hold on.
Jason.
I understand that. We're in the middle of a discussion. We're 10 minutes past the end of our evening, and I do want to address the questions. These are the exact items that we've talked about addressing through our regs. We have the ability to regulate setback in our community.
We don't agree with you, just so you know. That's a
question.
That's a legal
That's why we're here to
question.
talk about.
And so as part of this discovery process, we need to identify those things like setbacks that we want to be able to deal with, understand the position of industry, understand the position of our hired attorney, and then determine what course of action we want to recommend council take. Do we want to have council put forward a request for 1,000 yards and see what happens, or do we want to see what we can negotiate through a memorandum of understanding on how those things are going to happen in Commerce City? We can't solve anything until we can start to put things on paper and say that we want to solve for them. Does that make any sense?
Well, Jason, it makes complete sense to me, because as I view it, the primary goal of this committee is to formulate some rules and regulations that the city's going to enact, and to work out the content of those and the memorandum of understanding that we're trying to work out with the industry and all the other people at the table. And have we made any progress towards accomplishing that goal tonight?
Yes, we have. We've informed our citizens of what's going on, because they have to be an active part of what this process is doing and where this process is at.
Because we're going to have another decision on February 27th.
So,
and I would hope that we're going to have the content of some MOU or some proposed rules and regs by that time, so we can make a decision, because it's going to be another decision that we're going to have to make. I don't know whether they're going to agree to a voluntary extension of the moratorium or not, or whatever you want to call it, a moratorium or a no fracking or whatever you want to call it. But anyway, it's not happening in Commerce City right now, and we've got 60 days so far, and I want to see something proposed for our oil and gas regs that we can enact, and I want to see the content of a memorandum of understanding so we can talk about that, say, let's work on this, here's paragraph 1, paragraph 2, let's get it done.
I think
see if we can reach an agreement. If we can't reach an agreement, then we put on the guns and go to war.
Totally agree. I think the point, though, is we clearly have two things that have to happen. We have a public that is rightfully hungry for information and wants to feel part of these discussions. The charter put forth by council for this committee set, not unlike any other committee that we've formed for our original rewrite of the Land Development Code or our comp plan or any number of other things, has a defined list of people who are there in a representative capacity and participate in discussions to come to some end. If we have need for more public Q&As, public discussions, what have you, then we need to set up those opportunities separate and or complementary to these discussions, because we will never make the progress that Mr. Benson just outlined if we don't try and find ways to solve both in appropriate manners. And so what I would like to suggest is, rather than assume that we don't want to do what's right, let's bring forward ideas and suggestions on how we modify that, so that whether it's me or Mr. Benson or Mr. Douglas, we can propose those things and get the support of council to say, hey, we need to do 2 or 3 more public forums at Landmark, and this is what we think should happen there. And separately, we think this should be the set of agendas that this committee is solving for. If I were sort of to tell you what my ideal would be, I'd love to see this committee make some forward progress and then be able to go as a committee so that you as a public or as a representative of the public could participate in that panel and talk about what's happening. I'm open to anything, and I think my peers on council want to be creative with this process as well. So that said, I know Ms. Barta has a question. I want to pass the mic. Go ahead, ma'am.
I feel like there's not a lot of time to ask questions, and I'm getting a sense from you that you don't want questions right now, so I'm not sure where to really go with my questions.
Could you please identify yourself and ask your question? Go ahead.
Hold on. Just to be clear, I stopped the meeting discussion.
Okay. I just want to tell you that's my experience. That's what it feels like to me throughout the meeting. You mentioned the map. My first question that came up from that was, I've examined and looked at that map numerous times over the last couple of months, and what I'm curious about now is, of all of those wells, I know there's a description of what's permitted, what's been locked or shut down, all those different things, but I'm curious, of all of those wells, is there potential for every single one of them to be fracked and explored? Or are there some on that list that will be left or could be left? I know you don't know. I know you can't say you are planning, but what's the potential for all those dots? Is it potential for every one of those dots to be hydraulically fracked?
I'm going to take a run at it.
Phil, I'd love to hear from Phil. Thank you.
This is a way you could get off dead center. Obviously, the oil and gas industry does not have a plan that they can share with the public. So I propose that we draft our own plan. And the way you would go about that is simply find out how much land has been leased to the oil and gas industry in the city of Commerce City and the directly surrounding area. We can make estimates about how many wells that would take, how many wells they might implant, how much water it would take. We can go to Weld County and look at the percentage of wells that have been refracked, reopened up there as a result of this new rush. And we could come to our own conclusion. We might even be able to give them a plan. Now, whether the people of Commerce City would be willing to submit to that plan is up to them. But we're on dead center because we're relying on the oil and gas industry to give us information they're unwilling or unable to give us. So we make our own plan. But we first have to have the amount of acreage that's under lease to the industry. Now, you have to assume if they lease it, they want to do something with it. And you have to assume that they're going to look at these old wells, and if they're capable of being reopened, that they will do that. And you can start getting an estimate of what you're looking at in terms of industrialization.
And I think that was exactly part of our discussion 2 weeks ago, right, that as we progress in these discussions, we want to come away with what those potential intensities are. How many sites could be active at any one point in our city, and what might the impact of that look and feel like? And as a result, what are the changes to our rules that we want to put in place to safeguard? That, I think, is at the foundation of this whole process. And the challenge in getting there is we all, including me, and my boss back at home when I come home tonight, is going to want to know, where are we at, right? We can't get there until we walk through all the pieces of the puzzle to get there. And I think you've just outlined in a very good sense what it is we want to be able to assemble.
It's very simple. That's the way you do it.
And so, again, I think we had suggested a progression of meetings that out of each, in my mind, I think of it like a business case, right? I'm going to have X number of sites. I'm going to have Y number of days per site where, so that as
Bottom
we...
line is we need that.
That's right.
Yeah, it sounds like the answer is we need to get that information.
I
That's
think
the
you would-
answer. And maybe that's on the agenda for next time. Right? I want to also just, it's not really a question, but I want to follow up on what Jim said, Mr. Benson said about wanting to get some real meat going on here. It's been a month and a half, almost 2 months, and I thought this was a group to start writing regulations, or at least exploring that, not a discovery of gaining new information, because you all know the information. And I guess my comment is there's always going to be two stories to every issue, two sides. There's obviously some polarization in the room tonight, and you're not going to get to any agreement. So just do the work. Keep us safe. Please do what you need to do to get the regulations in place. And I know there's one other person here that wants to speak.
Jason, can I do a question? Sandy Jakewith, and I have a question actually. I hate to interrupt the conversation over there, but I think it goes back to you, Kent, and to you and the gentleman from the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission. If I understood correctly tonight, I think you said that you guys have about 15 inspectors and Colorado Department of Health has about 4 inspectors. And what I'm wondering is, what is the difference in terms of what you inspect? Do you do inspections on the basis of the same regulations and it's just a different part of government doing that, or do you look for something different, each of you?
No, our inspectors are they are looking at the oil and gas operations at a whole. So those are the 15 inspectors are inspecting. If they're inspecting drilling operations, they're looking at those. They're inspecting those drilling operations and making sure that there's no issues associated with those. If they're inspecting completion, hydraulic fracturing activities, again, that's what they're inspecting. If it's an active producing facility, they're looking at the production equipment, the wellhead, the location itself. They inspect for stormwater, which is shared responsibility with the health department. They inspect for spills and releases at that time. And then we also have reclamation inspectors that go out after the well has been closed. We call it plugged and abandoned, and the site has been reclaimed. They inspect to make sure that they've met the reclamation requirements. So that's our 15 inspectors. I mean, they're the whole gamut of the oil and gas operations, and they are versed in every aspect of that. We have some reclamation specialists, but the others are looking at the whole thing, and that includes our environmental staff. When they're doing their inspections, that's typically spills and releases. And then, Kent, I'll let you speak to your inspectors.
The air quality inspectors are simply looking at air quality and the permit requirements when they visit a site. And so they're not looking at the site and the issues that the COGCC are looking at. They're there strictly to look and see whether or not they're meeting their permit requirements.
And so the permit requirements are different. You're talking about different permit requirements?
These
are air
yeah,
permit
it's a totally
requirements.
different process. The air quality permit is issued by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and the drilling permit is issued by the Oil and Gas Commission. There's separate permitting processes.
And I presume that the Oil and Gas Commission, what you're doing is enforcing statutes as well as regulations, and are those all set forth on your website?
Yes, absolutely. We're enforcing the Colorado Oil and Gas Act, which is the statute from which our rules are derived. We're enforcing our rules, and the other thing that's critically important is we're enforcing conditions of approval on each permit. On each permit to drill, you heard APD earlier, and that's application for permit to drill. On each permit, and it has an associated oil and gas location assessment, which the permit looks at the hole, the APD looks at the hole, the wellbore. The location assessment looks at the ground surface and the impacts associated with that. So there's two parallel permitting tracks within our agency that have two different groups reviewing them. And then the inspection, so the inspection process from our standpoint is also looking at conditions of approval that are placed on those permits. So we might put a special condition on because we're closer to residents. We might put a condition of approval on that pertains to truck traffic. We might put a condition of approval on that pertains to noise and lighting or dust mitigation.
So does your commission then promulgate regulations under the statute?
Yes, that's the process by which the regulations happen, yes.
So if the citizens disagreed with the kinds of rules that you use, they would have to go through the legislature to address the statutory regulations or come through the commission regarding the regulations underneath the statutory laws, right?
Yeah, citizens could come before our commission and file a hearing application for a rulemaking. And we could develop rules based on that process. Absolutely.
Great, thank you. And one final question for Kent. Is there a different aspect of CDPHE that deals with water contamination as opposed to air contamination?
Well, there is. There's the Water Quality Control Division, but back in 1989, Senate Bill 181 was put in place, and the reason that was done was to define which agency was going to be responsible for, in this instance, groundwater and surface water. And the classifications are all dictated by the Water Quality Control Commission and the standards that are in place for both groundwater and surface water. However, with that bill, there was an MOA that was signed between our two agencies, and the commission, the Oil and Gas Commission, is responsible for maintaining groundwater quality and responding to spills associated with oil and gas.
And who sets the standards that they promulgate?
Water Quality Control Commission.
Thank you.
And I'll add as a side note, Debbie Baldwin, our environmental manager, who spoke at a community meeting here in Commerce City a number of weeks back, is actually preparing her annual report to the Water Quality Commission, and she will be delivering that report on February 16th, I believe. And to the best of my knowledge, that's a public hearing as well. And that'll be over at the CDPHE offices.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg.
Jason.
For God's sakes. The offsets.
As far as the setback?
Yeah, related to that.
Go ahead.
So I'm a mechanical engineer. This will be technical.
This is more from curiosity, not totally understanding the fracking processes, but when a well is dropped and there's an offset, it's going to sit in some position within some distance of our community. The fracking process that occurs, and the way I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you go down and things go out laterally to explore and pull the gas, oil, whatever out of the ground. Is that correct? Is that a good assumption?
Basically, in a nutshell, what we do is we pump some type of fluid under high pressure, and it basically cracks the rock open. And we usually pump some type of proppant, so it'll crack the rock open, and we'll leave that proppant in that fracture of that rock, so then the oil and gas has a suit. Instead of having to flow through this rock that's got little tiny spaces in it, it has that where it can flow a lot faster and a lot quicker.
So, but that is...
And proppant, the proppant we use is a natural sand. It's a sand that's mined out of Ottawa, Illinois, typically. It's just a natural, and there's different size sand particles. The ones that we run around here are typically a 30-50 and a 20-40, and I can get into that if we need to, but it's not necessary. But it's not playbox sand.
Yeah.
It's sand.
In a typical well that goes down of the type that you guys are all planning to put out here in whatever quantity, when that well goes down, what's the impact radius under the ground that's going to happen here? The reason I ask the question is basically, it's a very simple thing for me and my family, is if there's a well sitting X thousand feet away from the edge of our community, what happens under the ground related to our properties and things like that? Because for me, understanding what's going in the ground from the chemical perspective and how far that reaches out, lets me make an informed decision if that's a place I want to live on top of. So I'd like to know that information, what the real impact is underneath the ground. Because if I'm living on top of chemicals that I don't feel comfortable with, that's information I can make an informed decision about whether I want to be living in that community anymore. So that's the kind of thing I would like to hear. You got 47,000 wells? Something like that. So there's obviously some knowledge base of what that impact is that's occurring under the ground that I don't think us as citizens really understand.
Yeah, and it's not that, believe me, it's not that we want to hide anything from you guys. Is a lot of the geological things that are laid down affect that. So there are several measuring techniques that we have done on wells. You can listen with microseismic devices and offsetting wells. And you can kind of pinpoint how long the fracture is. And if I gave you an exact example, I'd be telling you the lie because we don't know until we frack it. But we have frack lengths anywhere between, they're typically around 500 feet out to 1,500 feet is an average that I can give you. So they have been longer. Like usually a good way to think about it is it goes out in 2 wings from the well bore. So you're going to go out in 2 directions, and you're going to probably go out an equal length in each direction. So you can figure 500 feet in each direction.
Well, and I guess that would be tied to that idea of offsets when we're talking about the safety of our community. And to Mr. Benson's comments, well, if it's an offset, is that something that we can have a conversation about to say, it's going to fraction rock 2,000 feet or a half mile into our development and under our homes. Can we get pushed further out and say, if you're out here, that's less impact to it?
And the difficulty would be you're regulating something that we have a trouble measuring anyway. So you can regulate the offset of where the wells will be placed, but as far as the fracture, where the fracture reaches to, that's going to be a very, very difficult thing to regulate.
And just to tie this back in, I think two things. There's a presentation, sir, that, again, I'll sound like a broken record, that we received from in a presentation several weeks ago that gives a really good overview of the process and some of the depths. We had information in our meeting 2 weeks ago from COGCC that talked about the depth of the wells that would be likely here, given where the formation exists. Greg, it's 9,000, 8,000.
I believe it's about 7,000
7,000
under here, and that's.
Oh, is this okay? That's that map. So maybe we can pull that out for you here in a moment.
Well, I guess that goes back to your comments earlier, which
Yep. And so we've got the high-level process. What we want to do, and I'm going to try and get us here to this point because we're now 30 minutes past where we promised folks we would go home, and this is all incredibly valuable conversation. We want to have a specific discussion on the drilling and the fracking and say, based on what the intensities are, what are the things that we need to be changing or asking for to be done by industry when performing those practices in our community? And so we want to have that specific discussion. So,
and just quickly, I want to add on to that. Oops, whoa, that's loud. Sorry. I want to just quickly add on to that too. And while Charlie is sitting here, the data on where those 1.3 million gallons of toxins are as well. So that I think that is also part of that plan, because when we're fracking out, and where some of these wells are very close to the arsenal, and based on where those 1.3 million gallons of toxins are, that also needs to be a part of that analysis as well.
Brandon, could you answer a question for me?
Yes, sir.
In that 1.3 million gallons, how much chemicals being put in that? Can you tell me percentages of water and chemical?
She's referring to the arsenal, correct?
Yeah, I'm referring to the Rocky Mountain Arsenal.
Okay.
But as a percentage, in our fracks, we're at 0.4 to 0.6% of the total volume of the liquids going into that frack are chemicals. The rest of it's water and sand.
Yeah. I'd like to answer a question that was asked a long time ago. Hillcorp's leased acreage within the city limits is 2,685 acres. We have 3 permitted wells. One of them, as you all know, is waiting for a permit to be recompleted. One of them was recently fracked, and I'm not sure, to be honest with you, of the status of the third. I think it's producing. Hillcorp has no current plans to drill additional wells. in Commerce City. If the well that we're waiting to recomplete is recompleted and fractured, to address one of your questions, and it's a gusher, we'll drill more wells. And that's part of how the process works, and part of why it's not easy to sit here and say to you tonight, we're going to drill 20 wells next year, or none, or 160. It's a process of making a capital investment, seeing what the return on the investment is, seeing if the geology for that well looks like geology for the next well over, and whether that capital investment decision makes sense. So Mr. Doe and I think Mr. Wilson have both offered over time to, plan out a scenario for you, and they could do it. Mathematically, they could do it, but I don't think it would have a lot of value in terms of a real-world likely outcome for many reasons, a couple of which I've touched on.
What would? What would?
Can I ask a question, Matt?
Sure.
Under the current spacing orders that apply to the leasehold that you have, how many vertical well completions could you drill, in assuming you had surface access? Is that a reasonable question to ask?
It is a reasonable question, Greg. I accept that I don't know for sure the spacing, but roughly, in outside of GWA right now, I think you're probably limited to 16. I got to think about this. 16 per quarter, so times 4. You could do 64 wells in a 640-acre tract. That would be very high density.
That would be 10-acre spacing.
Yeah, 10-acre density. 4 per 16.
So I think 10-acre spacing is like what they're doing on the west slope.
In the Pions.
And so I think, actually, now that you're refreshing me.
Make sure you tell them what the 10 acres is. It's down.
Correct.
Right.
And so we're talking about, again, going back to the spacing question, if you take an area, how many wells you can put in it, or conversely, if you have one well, how much area down in the producing formation, 7,000 feet below ground, does that well operate in or have the rights to operate in? And you did, in answering the question, or getting there, you did remind me that the statewide spacing rule effectively limits drilling without a spacing order to change it to one well per 40 acres. So that would be in a 640-acre 1 mile by 1 mile section. And in this map, each of these numbered squares is a section. You could have 16 wells in that 1 mile section, assuming they drilled vertical completions either straight down or what we call directional, and the Anadarko presentation talked about going down from one location over and down, and you're still vertically oriented to the formation. That said, where we've, I think, kind of been trying to go is that may not be what the field looks like here, and these guys don't know that yet because they're still gathering data. And eventually they could do horizontal wells, which would be subject to a different spacing order that would be determined at the time that they present that application for a spacing.
Greg, maybe this is relevant.
To our commission.
I thought I understood that both these companies are targeting the Niobrara. What kind of spacing does the state have for horizontal wells in the Niobrara and the Waterbury?
And we answered that question in the first meeting, and I remember that pretty explicitly because I didn't have the answer at the time, and Matt answered that question. There is no current spacing rule for horizontal wells in the Niobrara. They're developing it as they go based on what the formation will yield.
Right now, the most horizontal wells right now in a Niobrara 640 in Colorado is 9. That's the most. And again, we are learning as we go. It depends on how far out those fractures go. So right now they're letting us put wells that we have spacing orders that allow us to complete wells 150 feet apart. So you could do that math. There are setbacks from the spacing line, from the unit line. So you take that 640 and you have to come in 460 feet on all sides. Okay, you can't drill any closer than 460 feet to the section line on all around. And you could figure that out.
On the horizontal frac.
Yes, yes.
All right, well, that's the point, though. I think we're getting to someplace here. What we call this in the National Environmental Policy process is reasonably foreseeable development.
Reasonably foreseeable?
Reasonably foreseeable. We understand the company's going to make its capital investment as it sees fit. But you in this community can certainly take advantage of what was just discussed here. They're after oil, principally in the Niobrara. The technology to do that in Wattenberg is favoring horizontal wells, up to 9 per section. I was only going to put 8 per section in our reasonably foreseeable estimate. So for Hillcorp, we could take their 4.2 sections they just announced they have under lease and project for the community for its consideration 8 times that, or 34 wells within the city just by Hillcorp. And that helps you as community members and planners to see what's coming, what could come. Now, no. No.
It's not projected. It doesn't show what.
No, that's a map of existing wells. What we're trying to do now is project the future, and that's been very helpful. How many acres does Anadarko have leased within?
Well, if we're going to do the math, why don't we go back to the spacing that we've been talking about at 20-acre spacing in the Wattenberg, which is what we're allowed for vertically. Right. Let's do 32 wells per section.
You could do that for a range.
And multiply it out.
Right.
Will that ever happen? Probably not.
Well, the reason I wouldn't do that, because I understand you're after the Niobrara. I understand,
so
we
Mr.
all understand
Wilson,
that.
Thank you for the math. Okay. Let me just tell you, in reality, that's not going to happen.
What's not going to happen? The 32 wells?
The projection. We're not going to accept your projection. And in
reality, I'm looking for your
try to
acceptance. I don't want your acceptance. I want the community to understand what they can do.
Gentlemen, all the way around.
If you want to have a conversation about this, if you want to sit down and say, you get the well in your backyard as opposed to putting it out in an open space because your math just so happens to come into that situation, we can certainly do that. What we're trying to tell you is we are here as a resource to this committee and to this community to make sure you are making, as elected officials, which these folks are, informed decisions on behalf of their constituents. This is not an informed decision. This is speculation at best.
That's a normal process.
Probably at the worst. So, I mean, let's talk about reality.
Well, I disagree. It's normally done in environmental impact statement process.
And Mr. Wilson,
in exactly that way. And I'm quite an expert in this field. And so this conversation is going fine. I'm not projecting that they produce 32 wells vertically, because this industry is moving towards horizontal wells. There's 7 or 8 horizontal rigs in the state now. This resource is being developed horizontally. We can take the information we just got of 9 wells per section and estimate that Hillcorp alone would do 34 wells. And it's very reasonable for you to consider that.
It's absolutely
you can estimate
However,
that is an outside boundary parameter. That's true. You could do
planning's
that.
sake.
You could use a lot of other statistical and planning information. What is the average? Let's take Weld County. I mean, Weld County's been drilling wells for decades. Why don't you figure out the density in Weld County of how many wells per acre there are?
Because that includes the DJ, D sands, and J sands in the Dakota. And
which we've been producing in the Wattenberg field for 40 years.
Okay, I'm anticipating. All right. I'm anticipating that 8,800 leases issued on the Front Range are focused on developing the Niobrara horizontally.
Which
because
is why
of the economics that has proven to be
Which is
so
why
successful.
we're here.
Okay.
Right? Just to put this in context, council sees the fact that this is the tip of the iceberg. We had one well. We've established a committee to educate our community and ourselves to make an intelligent decision. We want to get to the point of the exact formula that you're talking about that Mr. Doe brought up a few minutes ago. I'm looking at an agenda progression that we put out 3 meetings ago when I solicited ideas from this entire body for suggestions on how we should approach and attack this discussion to get to those decision points. The responses I got from this committee were one. I put together a draft of proposed meeting agendas, and I put that out in our meeting 2 weeks ago. And had we followed that, on January 25th, when we didn't meet, we would have had a dedicated session talking about the environment. It was suggested in that discussion we talk about toxicology, hazardous waste, baseline water sampling, geology of Commerce City, and seismology, to the extent that it applied to the conversations that we were going to have beyond that point. The consensus from the panel that night was that no, we have other things that we want to know. Let's not meet on the 25th. So we canceled that in favor of meeting tonight to talk through all the responses to the questions that have been put out there. Tonight, we've done a piece of that. Had we stuck with the originally proposed agenda for tonight, we'd be talking about well siting and permitting. The permitting process, positions by entity, which we've now gotten into sort of backwards, rough development plans by year to start to assemble some of those rough math calculations, what we might expect in this area based on new wells and recompletes. This committee decided not to talk about that tonight. The proposal for next week was to talk about well drilling, completion, and recompletion so that we could come away with an understanding of the intensity of that activity by number of wells. Potential risks and current/standard mitigation to air, water, noise, and other nuisance factors. What's happening in the current domain? What do you expect your plans to be in Commerce City in those regards? And then let's talk about what we want to ask for different for Commerce City. I don't know that we're in a position to jump into that discussion next week, but I'm desperately hoping that we can get to a point where we can agree on a set of discussions that are framed in that fashion so that we can all leave feeling like we accomplished something. Because I'm selfishly going to leave tonight feeling like people are going to leave frustrated. We need to bring this discussion to a close, and with all due respect, ma'am, we need to discuss what we're going to meet on next week and agree.
I just have one more question.
What's the subject of the question?
It's a question from the citizen.
I'm sorry. Is this removable?
No, don't pull it out.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to say that tonight I heard somebody make the comment that we shouldn't worry about air quality because we already have pollution here because we have a couple refineries and you know, shouldn't be a big deal.
Just to be clear.
Well, it sounded like that.
Kind of what was said.
Yes.
So you'll be able to address that.
Yeah. And then, you know, the night that the COGCC came in protest, I heard from one of the gentlemen that came forward in the audience to say, well, you shouldn't worry about this because you live in Commerce City and you already are used to having industrial here. You spoke about capital investment. I want you to consider our capital investment as well. It's not as large as yours, but it's closer to our hearts.
Thank you. I could continue to try and throw out suggestions for how we proceed. My sense is that that is a futile effort. So I will re-extend the offer for suggestions on how to approach our next 3 meetings. We've lost significant time to start to develop specific recommendations for our council to consider. We need to have black and white progress in hand when we leave here on the 22nd. If we don't, I can all but guarantee that if we were to ask for an additional period of time to continue these discussions, that's probably not likely, which puts us in an awkward spot. Because I would certainly like to try and get to a point where we have a a dialogue that gets us to an amicable end and potentially gets us protections that we might not get if we were to go down a different path. I want to be able to ask the experts around this table questions and get answers, even if I feel like I need to go get additional information to help substantiate or add additional color and perspective. But if we try and meet under this same format next week, I don't feel like we're going to make a lot of progress. So that's my perspective. I'm open to hearing from the others at the table on where from here.
Mr. Chairman, I think, we were just talking, I mean, we can fight all we want in here. We're not going to ever get any further down that road that I think you're doing a very good job of trying to get us down. We were just talking, and we mentioned this at the last meeting, if it would be helpful, we can sit down with your council and put together a set of draft regulations that we think that hopefully Phil has the authority to discuss with you all. And that could be the focus of how you move this agenda forward, rather than fighting about details or fiction or fact or studies or this not, whatever. I mean, we're not going to come to agreement about any of that stuff in these. But if we had a document to focus on that was moving the agenda forward so that you can go back to your constituents and say, we are regulating this industry and protecting the citizens of Commerce City from whatever the issue may be, and come forward with some recommendations at that point. I honestly think, as I've said repeatedly, you will be pleasantly surprised at how willing we are to work with you all to make sure that these folks are taken care of in this process. We're not trying to bowl anybody over in any of this. So if that's, we offer that up as a possible solution for you all.
And I appreciate that offer. We actually talked about a similar approach with Mr. Barber, building either from our existing regs and showing where we had opportunity to affect change and how intense a change or radical a change we might make in a given area. I think either way, having a framework to guide it, whether it's the actual regulations or the process and our concerns and questions and desires to change by looking at the process, I'm open to either. I want to help facilitate a process that's going to make everybody feel like, not just feel like, but believe and know that they're being heard, that we're collectively considering the right things, and that we're going to do what we can do to the limit of what the law will tolerate, if you will, and that we're being respectful, right? I get to fight with people.
Can we interject here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because what I'm hearing is that we're just going to go ahead and we're going to build the regulations out.
No,
Can I please speak? Because basically what I heard, and again, my perception, which is my reality, is that you would like to cut all of us out of here, make it very easy. Again, I'm talking about perceptions, okay? That's exactly what I'm talking about. And you know what my foundation is? This is my foundation. Last week, anybody who had eyes or ears could tell that you were so unengaged in our meeting. You made the same statement, and you then...
This is becoming a personal attack.
Guys.
And I don't need to sit here and put up with this. We're here doing a courtesy to you all.
Point of order to the audience.
Doing us any courtesy, and you're telling us you're the nice guy. We know. No, Dan, this gentleman is telling us, get out of the way, let's just do the regulations.
I did not hear that, and I don't know that others around this table heard that.
We heard him last week say the same thing.
Okay, bygones. We are here now, and we are trying to chart a way forward. Understand that there was a concern about his response or the perceived response last week. What I heard him say, and I'd like to restate it because I think it made sense, as an option, right, a menu option that we can pick from, was to say, would it make sense as a starting point for this body to discuss from for Mr. Barber and industry to put together some place for us to start so that we could go through, right? Today, we have the Commerce City Land Development Code, right? We've been charged with amending that code to introduce additional safeguards for our community. Do we have a draft brought forward that we could then sit down and pick through? Or do we continue to talk in this fashion and hope that certain things come out of it that we can carry forward?
Well,
and I'm asking, the whole...
I agree with you 100%. I agree with you 100%.
Here's the bottom line. We're not making progress because obviously this process is not working. Okay? As the mediator, I think you need to evaluate this and say, what is not working? Potentially, and in my humble opinion, we need a mediator who is a completely neutral party. Okay?
And it's actually a suggestion that I was going to make tonight, because clearly there are some on the committee that are happy with the facilitation and others that are not. And if I am the gum in the works, then I will pull myself
No one
out
said
of
you were the gum in the
discussion.
works, but what I'm saying is I truly believe that it is a process that is not working here. There's absolutely no problem with citizens being able to express what they feel, what they would like to see happen, especially given the unique history of Commerce City. Now, do we do that here? Probably not. Do we do it someplace else? Do we provide that to your constituents, your constituents, your constituents? Do we do that? Yeah, we do. This is not the place for
And I think that was a
it.
suggestion that came forward earlier, correct?
I'm sorry?
And I think that was a suggestion that came forward earlier in this meeting, and I gave the example of divergent and parallel activities that this council can bring forward on Monday night and say, hey, council, we'd like your support to do this additional thing. My concern genuinely is that there is a lot that's been talked through in these 4 weeks, and not a lot of it's been heard and digested, right? We've got a lot flying around, and not everybody is leaving and on the same page. And so, yeah, how do we proceed in that fashion? So I've put out several times a request for ideas, specific ideas, on how to structure these meetings. And again,
We're busy trying to prepare for the meetings. I don't think we can be held responsible for what needs to be. You throw out the suggestion, I'm fine with this. I think you need to eliminate the issue of our citizens having a voice. That's what I think you need to eliminate from this process. But you need to then, in turn, provide a venue for them where that's possible.
And that point was taken. So we can continue to beat up the point, or we can all agree that we heard the point and we're going to carry that point forward. I guarantee Steve's going to bring that forward on Monday night as a motion, and I guarantee I'm going to second that motion on Monday night. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
I have a suggestion for how you might move forward on the suggestion on the table. I think the problem in terms of reaction that you're getting is the idea that industry is going to put forth model language or any kind of language on this. Perhaps knowing the kinds of concerns that have been raised. Mr. Barber, I know that they said there was model language last week that's available. Model language is usually fairly broad. That can be sent to Mr. Barber, and he can talk to citizens and city council about the kinds of pieces that need to be added into your regulation so that it's coming from the city and from the citizens in terms of their concerns rather than coming from industry. I think that would help solve this problem.
And Ms. Jakewith, I appreciate your restating that. I think that was actually part of the earlier comment, and I think, again, goes to the concern of whether the process is perfect or not. As participants, we have to listen and have to reflect on what's been said. We can't be preparing a defensive retort before we've heard somebody else finish. And that goes for everybody at this table, because we've all been guilty of it to some point in this process. So I don't dislike the idea. Are there others that think it makes sense for Mr. Barber to put together a straw man and that become the basis for our discussions?
Yeah, I think that makes a great deal of sense. All right, and what I can offer to the group in that regard is to forward you some excellent examples of such community regulations from Saguache, Pitkin, Gunnison County, and Broomfield. So we'll get suggestions in on additional setbacks, on green completions, on monitoring that are coming as suggestions into those communities' process.
And if I'm not mistaken, I believe Mr. Barber is actively soliciting that material in the background for consideration. So I think that's part of what you see in these meetings is not all the activity that's going on. Our planning staff, our city manager's office, our special counsel are doing work around this subject on an almost daily basis. And so what we're trying to do is feed into that process, provide additional perspective and color on areas of particular concern so that the straw man that Mr. Barber puts together takes into account all that we know about what's happened in other communities, the feedback that we get from industry, and then the
What I was suggesting, specifically communities that have stringent rules.
Yeah.
But see, that's what he's doing already.
Okay.
He's already ahead of that game and is reported back to us.
So let me see if I can recap, and we're going to actually do an old-fashioned show of hands. Consensus to allow Mr. Barber, ask Mr. Barber to come forward with a straw man, if you will, a draft of a starting point for regulations that can then be reviewed on a line-by-line basis by this committee, and that become the structure of our going forward meetings. Show of hands on who wants to participate.
Is that going to be, I thought our purpose is to gather information and we're done. Are we going to be debating regulations? I don't think that's the purpose of the committee. I think we're just going to enter our form and then maybe later council or residents get together and do this in their own little groups. Because if it's contentious now, it's going to get even worse when you try to debate regulations.
Jason, could I say something?
Mr. Doe?
I hate to be the dog in the manger, but you're going to write regulations over something you don't understand. I think before you write regulations, you should have a pretty good idea of the lay of the land. So my suggestion would be that for next week, you gather the information you need on land use and the potential in and around the city of Commerce City for the oil and gas industry. We know what they have. We don't know what they have. We don't know how many other players there are. And we don't even know how much land may be subject to leasing. It's important to the people of this city to know what the future is going to look like. The regulations aren't going to tell you what the future looks like. And then I would suggest on the second week you look at air. And I think you need to go for outside experts. You have an expert at the CDC who has warned that the United States has to do an examination of the impacts on air quality from fracking. We should be in contact with that person. We should be. I mean, he's an expert. He's a senior expert in the United States government. And then I would look at the seismic activity. Once you know the land and can make an estimate on the number of wells that may be possible, given the present rules, then you can start looking at the amount of water that's going to be used and compare that with what was used at the arsenal and the amount of PSI. And what was the PSI there, Charlie? Did you find out?
I did, and when I got to the housekeeping part, I was going to answer some of those questions.
Yeah.
I'm going to show you, but the maximum that was ever used was about 1,100 psi.
1,100. Okay.
It was generally in the range of 400 to 1,000.
Yeah,
but the maximum was 1,100.
Substantially less than they would be using on fracking. But that's a rational process. And so when you make your rules and regulations, you're weighing them against what's going to happen to you.
I think we're speaking the same language, and the alternative approach of starting from a regulation-based discussion versus the process or area focus-based discussion was put out there to try and elicit some input. So.
But
table full of participants and a table full of opinions. I've attempted to put a stake in the ground on several occasions.
Can I make a observation?
Barber? Yes.
I felt that the whole process, the whole reason that we were meeting was so that the people who are going to be writing and adopting regulations could hear what the issues were, could hear a sense from everybody around this table of what could and couldn't be done. So if you say, go write your regulations by next week, there are certainly regulations, there are draft regulations that could be circulated to everybody in this room today. Longmont's working on some, Frederick's working on some. That's easy to do, but the real question, I think, comes down to what can the people around here agree on, and if they can't agree, what is the council going to require? So I don't want to suggest anything. I think if you write regulations now, you will maybe be putting the cart before the horse. On the other hand, if people really want to look at what draft regulations other communities have enacted, that's something that's easily done.
The two Phils agree.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with you, and I guess I'm feeling this immense pressure to hurry up, and I'm wondering why that is. I understand why you want to hurry up, but why do we want to hurry up? That's my question.
Yeah, I sense the same sentiment on this subject as well, and I can understand as far as us all meeting together, and it doesn't always have to be this way. You know, we start out this way. We might have to break off here. The next meeting might have to be with the citizens and the city council, and then come back a couple of meetings with you guys, and then see where we're at as far as where we can start adopting some sort of regulations till we get to a certain point. And then, because this might play out for a while, because I'm looking at the fiscal year hearing schedule. There's one in January, there's one in March, one in April, one in May. We're going to Washington in March. There's going to be issues about that too. So and this should always be amended or looked at all the time throughout this whole process. This is not something that should be just written in stone and say, hey, we're going to go with that, because things change. Because you guys might get in there and disrupt things, and now we're back to square one. So we have to be very careful how we go about this, and make sure we make calculated decisions based on the facts. And I like to hear worst case scenario or the dark side of things, because that really puts things in perspective for the homeowners. Because basically that's why we're here. Is the residents have staked down in with the economy as bad as it is right now. People don't have a choice to sell their house and move. The jobs are hard to find. They want to keep what they have. So that's a delicate subject. So and then looking at things here, I can understand how you guys feel, and as me as a resident and sitting here at City Council, I have to take in consideration both sides, but my first goal is to protect the citizens, and like I say again, I speak for the ones who can't speak for themselves. So let's go ahead and look at what's been proposed and go forward with that, because that's what's important. And yes, the industry's here and they're going away, but we need to protect what we have, and let's just do it right. Because right now, the way we're going, we're already over an hour into our meeting, and just do the right things, and that's for the citizens. So, on
Jason,
that note
isn't it time that somebody made a motion about what we're going to do next week? I mean, let's make a motion and have a vote on it. I can't vote.
I'm going to do two things.
Vote, make a motion.
We're going to put a time. We're going to end no longer than 10 minutes from now. In that time, we need to agree to a meeting date and time for our next regroup. With this larger group, we would also be wise to suggest, or I think we'd be wise to consider a separate meeting, to Mr. Douglas's point, that is potentially the smaller group of citizens, staff, and council, to help further some of the discussion offline about other opportunities that we need to be looking at as a council in support of this effort, that don't necessarily make sense to have industry sitting through. So I'm going to suggest those two things that need to be decided. First, a meeting for next week with this full body.
I would suggest we have the citizen council meeting next week, and the oil and gas and the attorney meet next week separately in different meetings, and then a whole group meets 2 weeks from now. But then we've had our separate discussions. We come back as a group and explore what we found. But next week would just be separate groups, industry and Phil, and then the citizen. And it could be like we meet Thursday and they meet Tuesday and kind of pass on what they've come up with, something like that. Then again, we all meet next 2 Wednesdays from now. Oh, yeah. Is that a motion?
Ms. Bacon, I think you had a comment?
Yeah, I do have a comment. I'd like to, before we even decide what we're going to schedule, I'd like to make sure that we're getting the information, as Mr. Doe said, on the land, the leases, and the land that is suitable for leases. I'd like to get that information together first. Secondly, based on everything that's happened tonight, I would like to talk to my group, talk to my citizens. I don't know where we're at right now. And I'm not going to commit to any type of meeting until I know we have that information together and until I get to talk to my group. So that's where I'm at. We can potentially schedule a meeting for next week, but I'm not prepared to do that right now.
I'll make a motion for my plan.
Make a motion to what?
I'll make a motion for my plan.
I second.
Discussion?
Comments on Mr. Stapleton's suggestion? Comments on Ms. Bacon's suggestion?
I do have one comment. It's Jody.
Actually, it's Michael. My thing says Michael, so.
The lease, the mineral leases are matters of public record. It's a pain in the ass to track them down.
Exactly.
But you can do it.
What?
It can be done. I mean,
Oh,
you could,
absolutely.
you
Yeah,
know,
I know it can be done. Yeah.
maybe Phil and Wes want to do that to
Well, maybe
figure out
we'll
that
figure out
worst
who can
case
do that,
scenario.
right. I think that's the basis of everything, though. I think we need to get that information together. And quite honestly, after the events tonight, I need to regroup.